Hello everyone, I am Mr. Midnight. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. On a damp autumn evening in late October 2012, the seaside town of Whitford, tucked along the southern coast of England, was settling into its usual quiet rhythm. The tourist crowds had long since gone, the promenade lay mostly empty, and the sound of waves carried farther through the narrow residential streets. It was the kind of town where people still nodded to each other in passing, where doors were often left unlocked, and where serious crime felt like something that happened elsewhere to other people. That illusion shattered just after dawn on October 29th. At 6:14 a.m., emergency services received a call from a jogger who had taken an unusual route through Whitford Nature Reserve. His voice shook as he spoke. He said he had found something near the old footbridge. He wasn't sure what it was at first. Then he realized it was a body. Then he realized there was more than one. Police arrived within minutes, sealing off the reserve as the pale morning light revealed a scene that would haunt investigators for years. 3 bodies lay scattered near the shallow stream that ran beneath the bridge. A woman in her late 30s, a teenage boy, and a young girl no older than 10. They had not been placed gently, they had been discarded. Within hours, Whitford was no longer a quiet coastal town. It was the focus of national attention. The victims were identified by midday. Sarah Langford, 38, a primary school teaching assistant, her son, Oliver Langford, 14, and her daughter, Lily Langford, 9. They had been reported missing the previous evening after failing to return home from what was believed to be a short walk to the seafront. Their home, a modest semi-detached house less than a mile from the reserve, showed no signs of forced entry. Dinner plates were still in the sink. Coats were missing from the hallway. Everything suggested they had left voluntarily and expected to return soon. They never did. Sarah Langford was known throughout Whitford. She had grown up in the town, attended the same school where she now worked, and was described by colleagues as endlessly patient and quietly warm. After her husband died in a workplace accident 6 years earlier, she raised Oliver and Lily alone. Friends spoke of her resilience, of how she balanced long days at school with evenings helping Oliver with homework and listening to Lily practice reading aloud. Their lives were not extravagant, but they were close. By all accounts, they were happy. Oliver was at that difficult age where childhood and adulthood blurred. He loved football, argued with his mother about screen time, and had recently started secondary school. Lily was still openly affectionate, known for slipping her hand into Sarah's without thinking. Teachers described her as shy but imaginative, someone who drew pictures filled with color and smiling faces. There was nothing remarkable about the Langfords. That was precisely what made the crime so disturbing. Initial forensic analysis painted a grim picture. All 3 had been killed elsewhere and transported to the reserve. Sarah showed signs of restraint. Oliver had defensive injuries. Lily did not. The cause of death for all 3 was blunt force trauma delivered with shocking force. There were no signs of robbery, no sexual assault, no clear motive. Whitford police quickly realized they were dealing with something far beyond the scope of a typical local investigation. By that afternoon, the major crime unit had taken over. Roads were closed. Officers went door to door, asking the same questions repeatedly. Did you see the Langfords last night? Did you notice anyone unusual? Did you hear anything? The answers led nowhere. CCTV footage from nearby shops showed Sarah and the children walking along the promenade just after 7:00 p.m. The footage was unremarkable. Sarah held Lily's hand. Oliver walked a few steps ahead, earbuds in, oblivious to the camera. At 7:18 p.m., they turned down a side street that led toward the nature reserve. That was the last confirmed sighting of them alive. Investigators focused on the route. It was dimly lit but familiar. Sarah had walked it dozens of times. Residents described it as safe if slightly isolated after dark. The reserve itself was officially closed at night, but locals often cut through it regardless. There were no cameras inside. No witnesses came forward. As word spread, fear took hold. Parents kept children home from school. Evening activities were canceled. The promenade, usually busy even in off-season months, emptied before sunset. People who had lived in Whitford their entire lives admitted, quietly, that they no longer felt safe walking alone. Police began building a timeline of Sarah Langford's life in the weeks leading up to her death. They examined her phone records, emails, and social media. There were no threats, no arguments, no signs of conflict. Her financial records were unremarkable. Her routine was predictable: work, home, school runs, occasional trips to the shops. She rarely went out at night and never without her children. Attention turned to the school. Detectives interviewed staff, parents, and students. They asked uncomfortable questions about Sarah's interactions with others. Had she ever expressed concern about someone? Had anyone paid her unusual attention? One colleague recalled Sarah mentioning a man who sometimes waited near the school gates, watching parents collect their children. She had described him as odd but harmless. Another staff member remembered Sarah laughing it off, saying she probably spent too much time around anxious parents. No report had been made. That detail lingered. Within days, the press began to speculate. Headlines questioned whether the Langfords had been targeted or whether they had encountered someone by chance. Talk shows debated stranger danger versus known offenders. Online forums filled with rumors, some naming innocent locals as suspects. Whitford became a town under suspicion, its residents scrutinizing one another with new and uncomfortable intensity. Police appealed for information, releasing stills from CCTV that showed a man walking behind the Langfords at a distance along the promenade. His face was indistinct, his features blurred by low light and poor resolution. He could have been anyone: a jogger, a dog walker, a tourist passing through, or something else entirely. Hundreds of tips poured in. Most led nowhere. Some accused neighbors. Others pointed fingers at ex-partners, acquaintances, people who had long since left town. Detectives followed every lead, however thin. They had no choice. Behind the scenes, frustration grew. There was no obvious suspect, no murder weapon, no forensic link to anyone in the Langfords' lives. It was as if the family had stepped into the night and vanished, only to reappear as victims hours later. As October turned to November, the case remained unsolved. Whitford's grief hardened into anger. Questions were asked about lighting in the reserve, about the lack of cameras, about why a town so close-knit had not noticed danger sooner. Memorials appeared along the promenade. Flowers piled up near the footbridge where the bodies were found. Children left drawings. Parents wept openly. And somewhere, unseen and unnamed, the person responsible watched the town change, watched fear take root, and remained silent. That silence would not last forever. As November settled over Whitford, the investigation took on a quieter, more methodical intensity. The initial chaos had faded, replaced by long days of interviews, data analysis, and the slow reconstruction of the Langfords' final hours. Detectives knew that cases like this were rarely solved through dramatic breakthroughs. They were solved through patience, through noticing the detail everyone else overlooked. The Major Crime Unit established a temporary command center in a council building overlooking the harbor. From there, teams worked in shifts, mapping movements, rewatching footage, and building profiles. The question that haunted them was simple and terrifying in its implications. Why this family? The nature reserve was searched again, inch by inch. Forensic teams combed through mud and leaves, using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar. They found nothing of significance. No weapon, no clothing fibers, no personal items belonging to the Langfords beyond what had already been recovered. Whoever had brought the bodies there had been careful or lucky or both. Attention shifted outward, away from the dump site and back toward where the murders may have occurred. Analysts began looking at properties within a 2-mile radius of the promenade route. Vacant homes, sheds, garages. Any enclosed space where a violent act could have taken place without drawing attention. Dozens of locations were checked. None yielded evidence. Sarah Langford's phone became a focal point. It had been found in her coat pocket at the scene, its battery dead. Digital forensics recovered partial data. The last outgoing message was mundane, sent at 6:42 p.m. to a parent from school, confirming a schedule change. There were no missed calls after 7:20 p.m., no unanswered texts. The phone had either been switched off shortly after, or it had lost signal. Oliver's phone was missing entirely. That absence bothered detectives. Teenagers rarely went anywhere without their phones. Oliver's friends confirmed he had it with him earlier that day. He had messaged a classmate about homework just before dinner. After that, nothing. No signal, no pings. It was as if the device had been deliberately removed from the equation. Police quietly contacted mobile network providers, requesting historical location data. The process was slow, bound by legal procedures, but when the information arrived, it added another layer of unease. Oliver's phone had connected briefly to a cell tower near the industrial estate on the edge of town at 8:03 p.m. Then, it went dark. That area was nowhere near the route Sarah normally took with her children. Investigators returned to the CCTV footage, this time expanding their scope beyond the promenade. They pulled feeds from petrol stations, takeaway shops, and traffic cameras along routes leading toward the industrial estate. Hours of grainy video were reviewed. Most showed nothing. Cars passing, delivery vans, people going about ordinary lives. Then, late one evening, an analyst noticed something. At 7:29 p.m., a camera outside a closed furniture warehouse captured a dark-colored van slowing near the entrance to an access road. The footage was poor, but the timestamp aligned with the window between the Langfords' last sighting and the cell phone ping. The van paused for several seconds, then turned in. No registration plate was visible. The vehicle was not reported stolen. It did not appear again on nearby cameras. It wasn't much, but it was something. Police released a public appeal for information about a dark van seen near the industrial estate that evening. They were careful with their wording, emphasizing it was a vehicle of interest, not a suspect. Still, the appeal reignited media attention. Reporters descended on Whitford again, pressing residents for reaction, speculating on air about possible abductions and organized crime. Tips flooded in. Many described vans, white vans, black vans, blue vans, tradesmen's vans, delivery vans. The sheer volume threatened to overwhelm the investigation. Detectives prioritized leads connected to individuals with violent histories or known access to such vehicles. One name surfaced repeatedly: Mark Ellison. Ellison was 46, a self-employed handyman who lived alone on the outskirts of Whitford, not far from the industrial estate. He owned a dark blue panel van. He had prior convictions for assault and unlawful restraint dating back more than a decade. He had served time in prison and been released on license. He was known to police, though he had kept a low profile in recent years. More troubling were reports from locals. Several people mentioned seeing Ellison near the promenade at odd hours. A shop owner recalled him lingering outside her store weeks earlier, watching families pass. A dog walker said Ellison had asked invasive questions about which routes parents took home at night. None of these incidents had been reported at the time. They had seemed strange, but not dangerous. Detectives brought Ellison in for questioning. He arrived at the station calm, almost relaxed. He answered questions without hesitation. He said he had been home the night the Langfords disappeared, watching television alone. No one could confirm it, but no one could disprove it either. His van, he said, had not left his driveway. He claimed it had mechanical issues. Forensic teams searched the van with Ellison's consent. They found tools, old stains that tested negative for blood. Nothing linking him directly to the crime. His home was searched next. Again, nothing conclusive. Ellison was released, though he remained under discreet surveillance. Public reaction was swift and harsh. Ellison's name leaked online. His photograph circulated on social media. Strangers confronted him in the street. He was spat at outside a shop. Police issued statements urging the public not to speculate, but the damage was done. Whitford needed a villain, and Ellison fit the narrative too neatly. Behind closed doors, investigators were uneasy. Ellison was suspicious, but suspicion was not evidence. They needed something solid. As December approached, the Langford case began to strain resources. Officers worked long hours, missing time with their own families as Christmas decorations appeared in shop windows. The contrast was painful. In Sarah's home, the tree remained boxed in the loft. The children's stockings were never hung. Then, just before Christmas, a new lead emerged from an unexpected place. A forensic accountant reviewing Sarah's bank records noticed a small but unusual pattern. In the months before her death, Sarah had withdrawn modest amounts of cash at irregular intervals. Not enough to raise alarms, but enough to suggest something out of the ordinary. When asked about it, friends said Sarah had mentioned helping someone who was in trouble, though she never specified who. Detectives returned to the school, this time focusing on parents. After several days of interviews, a picture began to form around one individual. Thomas Reed, a single father in his early 40s whose son attended the school. Reed was quiet, withdrawn, and known for struggling financially. Sarah had reportedly helped him with paperwork related to benefits and housing. She had even lent him money once, though she brushed it off as nothing. Reed lived near the industrial estate. When police interviewed him, he appeared nervous, sweating through his jumper despite the cold. He denied any involvement in the Langfords' deaths, insisting Sarah had only ever been kind to him. He said he hadn't seen her outside of school. When asked about the night of October 28th, his story faltered. He said he had gone for a drive to clear his head, something he often did. He couldn't say where. A check of vehicle records revealed Reed owned a dark blue van. This time, police did not rely on consent. They obtained a warrant. The van was seized and taken to a forensic facility. Days passed as specialists worked through every inch. Then came the call detectives had been waiting for. Traces of blood had been found beneath the floor lining. The DNA was degraded, but preliminary results suggested a possible match to one of the Langford children. The case shifted instantly. Reed was arrested on suspicion of murder and taken into custody. News broke within hours. Whitford reeled again, this time from a different kind of shock. The idea that someone known, someone Sarah had tried to help, could be responsible felt almost unbearable. Under interrogation, Reed denied everything. He claimed the blood was from an old injury to his son. He said the van had been used for years, that stains could come from anywhere. But when presented with the cell phone data placing Oliver's phone near the industrial estate, Reed's composure cracked. He asked for a solicitor. The interview ended. For the first time since October, investigators felt they were close, but they were not prepared for what would come next. The arrest of Thomas Reed sent a shockwave through Whitford that was deeper and more unsettling than anything that had come before. This was not a shadowy stranger or a drifter passing through town. Reed was a parent. Someone who had stood at the same school gates, attended the same assemblies, and exchanged polite nods with other families. The idea that danger had been so close, hidden behind quiet desperation and familiar routines, fractured the community's sense of safety in a way that could not be repaired easily. For detectives, however, emotion had to be set aside. The evidence needed to withstand scrutiny, and what they had so far, while troubling, was still circumstantial. Blood traces alone were not enough. The DNA sample was partial. The van was old. Reed's explanation, while shaky, was not impossible. Investigators knew that rushing forward without certainty could collapse the entire case. Reed remained in custody as forensic work intensified. Specialists re-examined the van using advanced techniques, dismantling interior panels, removing insulation, lifting sections of flooring that had never been touched before. It was slow, painstaking work. Every fiber was cataloged, every smear photographed, every fragment preserved. What they found changed the trajectory of the investigation. Beneath a layer of soundproofing in the rear cargo area, technicians discovered microscopic fibers that did not belong to Reed or his son. They matched the synthetic blend used in the Langford Children's School uniforms. Further testing revealed traces of accelerant residue, faint but unmistakable, suggesting an attempt at cleaning or neutralizing biological material. Someone had tried to erase what had happened inside that van. Meanwhile, digital investigators made a breakthrough with Oliver's missing phone. After weeks of dead ends, the device unexpectedly reconnected to a mobile network for less than 30 seconds in a neighboring county. The signal was weak, but it was enough. It placed the phone near a roadside lay-by off a rural A road, nearly 40 miles from Whitford. Police rushed to the location. What they found was devastating. Hidden beneath fallen leaves and discarded rubbish, officers recovered Oliver's phone, smashed but intact enough to yield data. Nearby, they found fragments of clothing that matched what Oliver had been wearing that night. There was no body, no grave, just the remains of something deliberately discarded. The discovery raised a terrifying question. If the bodies had been found together in the reserve near Whitford, why was Oliver's phone so far away? Investigators began to suspect that the crime had not unfolded the way they initially believed. Reed was brought back in for questioning. This time, the tone was different. The evidence was laid out piece by piece. The fibers, the blood, the phone, the accelerant. Reed's solicitor advised silence, but Reed spoke anyway. His voice shook. His hands trembled. He insisted he had never meant to hurt anyone. What followed was a confession that was fragmented, self-serving, and horrifying. Reed admitted that he had been struggling for months. Debt, threats of eviction, the crushing fear of failing his son. He said Sarah had been kind to him, too kind. He interpreted her help as something more, convincing himself that she understood him in a way no one else did. When she gently but firmly corrected that assumption weeks earlier, something inside him shifted. On the night of October 28th, Reed claimed he encountered Sarah and the children by chance near the promenade. He said he offered them a lift because the weather had turned colder. He said Sarah hesitated but agreed, recognizing him as a parent from school. That decision would haunt the town forever. According to Reed, once inside the van, panic took over. He said Sarah realized something was wrong and tried to leave. He claimed an argument followed. What he described next was disjointed, his words tumbling over each other, minimizing, deflecting, reframing violence as accident. Forensic evidence would later contradict much of what he said. What investigators could establish was this: the murders did not happen in the nature reserve. They happened inside Reed's van, parked in an isolated section of the industrial estate. The reserve had been chosen later as a dumping site, a place Reed believed would confuse investigators and buy him time. The accelerant residue was not from arson, but from an attempt to destroy evidence. Reed had cleaned the van obsessively in the days following the murders, scrubbing until his hands bled. It had not been enough. As for Oliver's phone, Reed admitted he had driven for hours afterward, spiraling, unsure what to do. He discarded the phone far from Whitford in a misguided attempt to sever any trail back to himself. The confession was enough to charge him formally with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder, based on evidence suggesting Emily may have initially survived the first assault. The charges were announced publicly the next morning. Whitford reacted with a mixture of horror and grim clarity. Parents looked back on small interactions with Reed replaying conversations, searching for missed signs. Teachers questioned their instincts. Had they noticed his isolation, his fixation? Could someone have intervened sooner? Media coverage intensified. National outlets descended on the town, framing the case as a story of misplaced trust and systemic blind spots. Commentators debated the risks faced by professionals like Sarah, whose roles required compassion and accessibility. The question echoed across headlines and panel discussions alike. How do you help without putting yourself in danger? As Reed was transferred to a high-security remand facility, new information emerged that complicated the narrative further. Psychiatric evaluations revealed a history Reed had concealed. He had been treated years earlier for delusional thinking and obsessive behavior, conditions that worsened under stress. His treatment had been discontinued when he moved counties, his records never properly transferred. No one at the school knew. No one at the local services office knew. The gaps were invisible until it was too late. For the Langford family's relatives, these revelations brought no comfort. Only anger. Anger at Reed. Anger at the system. Anger at the randomness of a moment that had changed everything. They released a statement through police, asking for privacy and urging the public to remember Sarah, Oliver, and Emily for who they were, not how they died. As winter deepened, the case moved toward trial. But even as prosecutors prepared what seemed like an overwhelming case, another truth began to surface, one that would challenge assumptions not about guilt, but about responsibility, accountability, and whether this tragedy could truly be called unforeseeable. The trial of Thomas Reed began in the spring, nearly 18 months after the night that had shattered Whitford. By then, the town had learned to live with its grief in quiet, measured ways. Flowers no longer lined the promenade. The posters had faded. Life had resumed on the surface, but the absence of Sarah, Oliver, and Emily Langford remained a constant, invisible presence. Reed entered the courtroom thinner, older, his once-unremarkable face now etched with strain. He pleaded not guilty to all charges, despite his earlier confession, claiming he had been coerced, misunderstood, and mentally unwell at the time of questioning. His defense team framed the case as one of psychological collapse rather than calculated brutality, arguing diminished responsibility and pointing to failures in mental health continuity that they said contributed to the tragedy. The prosecution's case, however, was relentless. Over the course of 10 weeks, jurors were walked through the crime in meticulous detail. Forensic experts described the interior of the van, the blood spatter patterns that demonstrated repeated, deliberate blows, and the positioning of the bodies that contradicted Reed's version of events. Digital analysts reconstructed Oliver's phone activity, showing how it had been powered on and off multiple times after the murders, suggesting conscious decision-making rather than panic or dissociation. One of the most harrowing moments came when the court heard the final voicemail Sarah had left for a colleague earlier that evening, a message filled with casual warmth, discussing paperwork and weekend plans. It was the sound of an ordinary life continuing, unaware it was nearing its end. Several jurors wept openly. Reed stared at the table, unmoving. Medical testimony dismantled the defense's claims of accidental death. The injuries, doctors said, could not have been caused in a struggle gone wrong. They were sustained, forceful, and intentional. Emily's injuries, in particular, suggested she had been alive for several minutes after the initial assault, a fact that led to the attempted murder charge being upgraded to murder mid-trial. When Reed took the stand in his own defense, his testimony only deepened the sense of unease. He spoke at length about his loneliness, his fear of losing his son, his belief that Sarah had understood him. At times, his language drifted into resentment, even entitlement. He described the night not as an eruption of violence, but as something that had happened to him, as though he were a bystander to his own actions. Under cross-examination, those illusions collapsed. The prosecutor calmly dismantled Reed's narrative, highlighting inconsistencies, confronting him with timestamps, locations, and physical evidence. When asked why he had driven 40 miles to dispose of Oliver's phone if he had nothing to hide, Reed had no answer. When asked why he had cleaned the van repeatedly over several days, he faltered. When asked why he had not sought help, called emergency services, or turned himself in, he finally broke down. The jury deliberated for 6 days. On the 7th morning, the courtroom filled quickly. The Langford family's relatives sat together, hands clasped, faces drawn. Reed stood as the foreperson rose, guilty on all counts. The sentence was mandatory. 3 life sentences to be served consecutively with no possibility of parole. The judge's words were measured but uncompromising. He spoke of trust violated, of vulnerability exploited, of a community forever altered by one man's choices. He rejected the defense's argument that systemic failure diminished Reed's responsibility, stating plainly that mental health struggles explained nothing and excused nothing. As Reed was led away, he did not look back. The aftermath of the trial reached far beyond Whitford. An independent public inquiry was launched within months, tasked with examining how Reed's mental health history had gone unflagged, how safeguards had failed, and how interagency communication had broken down so completely. The findings were damning. Records had been lost during administrative transitions. Risk assessments had been incomplete. No single failure had caused the tragedy, but together they had created the conditions for it. The inquiry's recommendations reshaped policy nationwide. Mandatory cross-county sharing of mental health risk data was introduced. Schools were given expanded safeguarding authority and training. Social workers received new protocols for personal safety, including limits on unsupervised contact and enhanced risk evaluation when dealing with distressed individuals. The reforms were later informally referred to as the Langford Measures, a name that carried both honor and sorrow. For Whitford, healing came slowly. A memorial garden was established near the promenade, a quiet space overlooking the sea where 3 trees were planted, one for each life lost. Sarah's colleagues continued her advocacy work, creating scholarships and support programs in her name. Oliver and Emily's school introduced annual community days focused on kindness, vigilance, and looking out for one another. Reed's son was relocated under a new identity, protected from the weight of a legacy he had not chosen. Authorities acknowledged publicly that safeguarding him was as necessary as any other protection, a rare moment of compassion in a case defined by brutality. Years later, the case is still cited in training seminars, policy debates, and courtrooms, not because of its sensationalism, but because of what it revealed. That danger does not always look dangerous. That systems fail quietly before they fail catastrophically. That trust, once broken, carries consequences far beyond a single crime. Sarah Langford dedicated her life to helping others feel safe, supported, and seen. Oliver and Emily lived in a world shaped by that same kindness. Their story ended in violence, but it continues in the changes they inspired, in the protection strengthened, and in the vigilance of those who learned, too late, that safety is never guaranteed, only guarded. And in Whitford, when the sea is calm and the promenade is quiet, people still pause at the garden, remembering not the horror of what happened, but the lives that mattered before it did. Story 2. On a humid summer night in July 2016, the quiet suburban streets of Olathe, Kansas, were wrapped in the kind of stillness that made the sound of cicadas feel amplified. Porch lights glowed softly, sprinklers clicked on and off, and families settled into routines shaped by predictability and trust. This was the heartland, a place defined by school fundraisers, Friday night football, and the belief that the worst kinds of crimes happened somewhere else. But inside a two-story home on a cul-de-sac lined with maple trees, a reality far darker than anyone imagined was unfolding, one that would ultimately expose years of warning signs, systemic blind spots, and a failure to protect those who could not protect themselves. This is the story of the Holloway family. To neighbors, Michael Holloway was the definition of reliability. At 44 years old, he worked as a senior logistics coordinator for a regional manufacturing company, a job he had held for more than a decade. Every weekday morning, his silver SUV left the driveway at precisely 7:12 a.m. He mowed his lawn every other Saturday, waved politely to neighbors, and volunteered twice a year at his son's school for career day. He was not charismatic, but he was consistent, and in suburban America, consistency often reads as safety. His wife, Rachel Holloway, was 39, a registered nurse at an outpatient surgical center in Overland Park. She worked long shifts but was known among coworkers for her compassion and tireless work ethic. Raised in Missouri by a single mother, Rachel had learned early how to balance responsibility with resilience. She was the emotional anchor of her household, the one who remembered birthdays, scheduled appointments, and ensured the children's lives ran smoothly despite the chaos of modern schedules. They had 3 children. Evan, 14, was entering high school that fall, tall for his age, quiet and deeply anxious beneath a calm exterior. Lily, 9, was creative and sensitive, often retreating into drawing and writing stories. The youngest, Noah, just 4 years old, was exuberant and curious, following his older siblings everywhere, desperate to be included. The Holloway home was full, loud, and by all outward appearances normal. But normal can be deceiving. The cracks in the Holloway family did not appear suddenly. They formed slowly, invisibly over years, hidden beneath routines and obligations. Michael had always struggled with control. Friends from college recalled him as intense, prone to brooding silences when things did not go his way. Early in their marriage, Rachel dismissed his rigidity as stress or personality quirks. He liked schedules. He liked predictability. He liked things done correctly. Over time, those preferences hardened into expectations, then into rules. Rachel adjusted, as many partners do, without fully realizing how much she was shrinking herself in the process. By 2014, Michael's job had changed significantly. Corporate restructuring increased his workload while reducing staffing, placing him under constant pressure to meet deadlines that shifted weekly. Around the same time, his father died suddenly of a heart attack, reopening unresolved grief and resentment from a childhood shaped by emotional distance. Michael never processed the loss openly. He returned to work after 3 days, refusing counseling offered through his employer. Rachel noticed the changes almost immediately. Michael slept poorly, pacing the house late at night. He became hyper-focused on finances despite their relative stability, repeatedly warning Rachel that one mistake could ruin them. He monitored household spending obsessively and grew irritable when plans changed unexpectedly. Arguments escalated from brief disagreements into hours-long lectures where Michael spoke and Rachel listened, exhausted and confused by the intensity of his anger. Still, there was no physical violence, no police calls, no bruises to explain, and in many systems, absence of visible violence equals absence of danger. Rachel confided in a coworker in early 2015 that she felt like she was walking on glass at home. She considered marriage counseling, but Michael refused, insisting that therapists were trained to blame men. When Rachel suggested individual counseling for him, he accused her of thinking he was crazy. She dropped the subject. The children felt the tension long before adults acknowledged it. Evan began experiencing panic attacks, which Rachel attributed to school pressure. Lily developed frequent stomachaches and begged to stay home from school. Noah became unusually clingy, crying whenever Rachel left for work. Pediatricians offered reassurance, suggesting stress or developmental phases. No one connected the dots. In November 2015, a neighbor overheard shouting from the Holloway home during a late-night argument. It was loud enough that she considered calling police, but ultimately decided against it when the noise stopped abruptly. She told herself it was just a couple fighting, something private, something not her business. In America, privacy often becomes a shield behind which danger hides. By the spring of 2016, Rachel began quietly planning an exit. She researched apartments near her workplace, consulted a divorce attorney during her lunch breaks, and confided in her sister that she feared Michael's emotional volatility was escalating. She did not believe he would hurt the children, but she worried about what might happen if she tried to leave openly. Her attorney advised caution, emphasizing that sudden separation could trigger unpredictable reactions in controlling partners. Rachel decided to wait until after the school year ended. Michael sensed the distance long before Rachel voiced it. He noticed her guarding her phone, her distracted responses, the way she flinched when he raised his voice. In his mind, these changes confirmed his deepest fear, that he was losing control over his family. And for Michael Holloway, loss of control was not just frightening, it was intolerable. In early July 2016, Michael began purchasing prescription medications under the guise of treating chronic back pain. As a logistics coordinator, he understood systems, quantities, timing. He also understood how to plan without drawing attention. He researched sedatives online, spending late nights reading forums that discussed dosages and effects. His browser history would later become a key piece of evidence. On July 18, Rachel told Michael she wanted to talk. She chose her words carefully, explaining that she felt unhappy, overwhelmed, and emotionally disconnected. She suggested a trial separation, framing it as a way to reset for the sake of the children. Michael listened silently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he nodded slowly and said he needed time to think. That night, he slept in the guest room. The next day, Michael called in sick to work for the first time in years. On the evening of July 20, he cooked dinner for the family, something he rarely did. Rachel noted the gesture but did not question it. The children ate pasta and garlic bread at the dining table, laughing about a movie they planned to watch afterward. Michael watched them closely, his demeanor calm, almost gentle. Later that night, one by one, the children became unusually drowsy. Rachel assumed the long summer days were catching up with them. She carried Noah to bed herself, kissed his forehead, and turned off the light. Evan and Lily followed shortly after, complaining of headaches. Rachel never made it to bed. The next morning, when Rachel failed to show up for work, her supervisor attempted to call her. No answer. By midday, concern grew. Rachel had never missed a shift without notice. Her sister tried calling, then texting, then driving by the house. The curtains were drawn. The driveway was empty. At 4:32 p.m., police were dispatched for a welfare check. What they would find inside the Holloway home would devastate a community, dominate national headlines, and raise haunting questions about how many warning signs can be missed before tragedy becomes inevitable. And as investigators began piecing together the events of that July night, one truth would emerge with brutal clarity. This was not a momentary snap, but the final act of a long, silent unraveling. When officers stepped through the front door of the Holloway home that evening, the air felt wrong immediately. There was no sign of forced entry, no chaos, no overturned furniture. The house was unnervingly clean, staged almost to the point of sterility. Shoes were lined neatly by the door. Dishes had been washed and stacked in the drying rack. A faint chemical smell lingered beneath the familiar scent of detergent and air freshener, subtle but unmistakable to trained noses. They moved slowly, announcing themselves as they advanced room by room. In the living room, nothing appeared out of place. Family photos lined the mantel. A half-finished puzzle sat untouched on the coffee table. The television remote rested precisely where it always did. It was the kind of domestic stillness that suggested routine had been interrupted, not by chaos, but by intention. The first body was found in the master bedroom. Rachel Holloway lay on the bed, positioned carefully on her back, hands folded across her abdomen. There were no visible signs of struggle. Her face was calm, almost peaceful, but the pallor of her skin told a different story. An empty prescription bottle sat on the nightstand beside her, its label partially torn away. Officers noted the deliberate placement immediately. This was not an accident. This was presentation. As they moved through the hallway toward the children's rooms, the gravity of the situation deepened. Evan and Lily were found in their respective beds, tucked in, blankets pulled up to their chests. Stuffed animals had been placed beside Lily, arranged with care. Evan's glasses rested on his nightstand, folded as though he had taken them off himself before falling asleep. Noah was found in his crib, lying on his side, clutching a small plastic dinosaur. All three children were unresponsive. Paramedics were called, though the officers already knew there was nothing to be done. Preliminary assessments suggested drug-induced respiratory failure. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of panic. The children had likely never known what was happening. Michael Holloway was not among them. As the house was secured and investigators began documenting the scene, the question shifted from what happened to where Michael had gone. His vehicle was missing. His phone went straight to voicemail. Credit card records showed no recent activity. It appeared that after ensuring his family would never wake up, Michael had left the scene deliberately, calmly, and with time on his hands. Within hours, an Amber Alert-style statewide bulletin was issued, though the children were already confirmed deceased. Michael Holloway was now the subject of a manhunt. Detectives quickly uncovered a chilling level of preparation. In the kitchen trash, they found packaging from over-the-counter sleep aids and crushed pill residue. In the bathroom, an empty bottle of prescription sedatives bore Michael's name, filled less than a week earlier. Toxicology specialists would later determine that the doses administered were far beyond therapeutic levels, but calibrated carefully enough to avoid vomiting or immediate distress. This was not a crime of impulse. Digital forensic teams accessed Michael's home computer and work laptop. His search history revealed weeks of research into sedatives, lethal dosages, and how to fall asleep peacefully. He had visited forums discussing assisted dying, bookmarked articles on carbon monoxide poisoning, and read personal accounts of suicide methods. Yet there was no evidence he had intended to die that night. Instead, there was something far more disturbing. A draft document titled Final Instructions sat saved on his desktop. It outlined bank account information, insurance policies, and passwords. It listed emergency contacts for extended family. There were instructions for selling the house, distributing assets, and handling debts. The document ended not with remorse, but with justification. Michael wrote that he was protecting his family from a world that would tear them apart, and from a future where they would suffer without direction. He framed his actions as mercy. By midnight, the story broke across local news outlets. Helicopters circled overhead as reporters gathered behind police tape. Neighbors stood in clusters, some crying, others stunned into silence. The Holloways had attended block parties. Their children had played in sprinklers together. This was not a family anyone had feared for. Rachel's sister arrived at the scene just after midnight. When officers informed her of what had happened, she collapsed, screaming her sister's name into the night. Her grief cut through the controlled professionalism of the investigation like a blade. Meanwhile, Michael Holloway drove east. License plate readers picked up his SUV on a highway outside Topeka at 7:18 p.m., then again near Lawrence an hour later. He stopped briefly at a gas station, paying cash. Surveillance footage showed him calm, composed, even polite to the clerk. There was no visible distress, no urgency. He bought a bottle of water, a pack of gum, and drove on. As investigators pieced together his route, a disturbing hypothesis emerged. Michael was not running randomly. He was heading towards somewhere specific. By early morning, his vehicle was spotted near a state park along the Missouri River, an area known for dense woods and limited cell reception. Police units converged, setting up a perimeter while search teams prepared for a possible suicide recovery. At 6:43 a.m., a park ranger found the SUV parked near a trailhead. Inside the vehicle, officers discovered a handwritten note on the passenger seat. It was addressed simply, "To whom it may concern." In the note, Michael claimed full responsibility for the deaths of his family. He insisted that no one could have stopped him and that what he had done was inevitable. He wrote that Rachel had been planning to leave, that the children would have grown up broken, and that the world was too cruel to allow them to suffer. The note did not apologize. A search of the surrounding area began immediately. Dogs traced Michael's scent toward the riverbank. After several hours, his body was recovered downstream, lodged against debris near the shore. The medical examiner would later confirm that Michael died by suicide, drowning after ingesting alcohol and sedatives. The manhunt was over. The answers, however, were only beginning. In the days that followed, the Holloway case gripped the nation. Headlines described it as a family annihilation, a term that carried both clinical detachment and unbearable weight. Commentators debated whether Michael's actions were driven by mental illness, narcissism, or a twisted sense of ownership over his family. Social media exploded with grief, anger, and confusion. But behind the headlines, investigators focused on accountability. Could this have been prevented? Rachel's phone revealed unsent messages to her sister, drafted but never sent, expressing fear that Michael was becoming increasingly unstable. Emails showed she had contacted a domestic violence hotline weeks earlier, though she never followed up after being placed on hold during a work break. Her attorney later confirmed that Rachel had been seeking guidance quietly, afraid of escalating the situation. School counselors recalled Evan's anxiety, but admitted they had not considered the possibility of danger at home. Pediatricians noted Lily's stomachaches and Noah's behavioral changes, symptoms that, in hindsight, mirrored chronic stress exposure. Yet none of it had triggered mandatory intervention. Michael's employer confirmed he had declined mental health support repeatedly, insisting he was fine. No one pushed further. The Holloway home, once a symbol of suburban normalcy, became a crime scene dissected for missed opportunities. The question echoed through press conferences and panel discussions alike. How many warning signs must appear before someone steps in? The funerals were held a week later under relentless summer heat. 4 white caskets stood side by side in a packed church. Too many for one family, too many for one lifetime. Photographs of Rachel and the children smiled from memorial boards, frozen in moments that felt impossibly distant now. Outside, strangers left flowers, notes, and stuffed animals. Messages scrawled on poster boards spoke of love, sorrow, and rage. Some blamed the system. Others blamed Michael alone. Many simply asked why. But the most unsettling truth lingered beneath it all. Michael Holloway had not hidden his unraveling completely. He had lived it in plain sight, masked by routine, respectability, and silence. And by the time the silence broke, it was far too late. As the investigation moved toward its final conclusions, one reality became impossible to ignore. This tragedy was not just about one man's actions on a single night. It was about the long, quiet erosion that preceded them, and the fragile line between control and catastrophe that too often goes unnoticed. In the weeks following the Holloway murders, the investigation transitioned from active pursuit to forensic reckoning. With Michael Holloway deceased, there would be no trial, no courtroom confrontation, no opportunity for the legal system to assign guilt through formal process. Instead, investigators were tasked with reconstructing intent, responsibility, and failure through evidence alone. Every document, digital trace, and testimony became part of a posthumous indictment. The Johnson County Medical Examiner's Office released its full autopsy and toxicology reports in early August 2016. Rachel Holloway and all 3 children had lethal concentrations of a combination of benzodiazepines and prescription sedatives in their systems. The drugs had been administered orally, likely mixed into food or drink. There were no signs of restraint, no defensive injuries, and no indications that any of the victims were aware of what was happening before losing consciousness. The cause of death for all 4 was ruled acute drug toxicity leading to respiratory failure. The manner of death was homicide. Michael Holloway's death was ruled a suicide. The precision of the dosages stunned toxicologists. The children's weights and ages had been accounted for with disturbing accuracy. Investigators concluded that Michael had likely conducted trial calculations beforehand, carefully determining how much medication would induce deep sleep without triggering nausea or alarm. It was a level of calculation that eliminated any lingering doubt about premeditation. Digital forensic analysis painted an even darker picture. Michael's phone contained a folder of deleted notes recovered by technicians, including entries titled Control, Escape, and After. In one note, he wrote that a clean ending is the only way to prevent chaos. In another, he described his fear of Rachel turning the kids against me, revealing a worldview rooted in possession rather than partnership. He repeatedly framed his family as extensions of himself, something to be managed, protected, and ultimately decided for. There was no evidence of psychosis, hallucinations, or delusional thinking. Mental health experts consulted by investigators concluded that Michael exhibited traits consistent with coercive control, emotional dependency, and narcissistic injury. His actions were not impulsive or driven by a break from reality. They were driven by a calculated belief that he had the right to decide his family's fate. That conclusion unsettled the public more than any diagnosis could have. As details emerged, scrutiny turned toward the systems that had surrounded the Holloway family. Rachel's outreach to a domestic violence hotline became a focal point of discussion. Records confirmed that she had called but disconnected before speaking to an advocate. At the time, the hotline was understaffed due to funding cuts. The call went unanswered for nearly 6 minutes. 6 minutes became a symbol. Advocacy groups seized on the Holloway case as a devastating example of how emotional abuse and coercive control often fall through the cracks. There had been no police reports, no restraining orders, no emergency room visits. And yet experts emphasized the warning signs were unmistakable to those trained to see them. Financial control, isolation, intimidation masked as concern, escalating rigidity, fear of leaving. The Kansas Coalition Against Domestic Violence released a statement urging lawmakers to expand the legal definition of domestic abuse to include coercive control, citing the Holloway case directly. They argued that the law's focus on physical violence ignored the realities faced by many victims who are trapped long before a hand is ever raised. Public response was intense. Town halls were organized across Johnson County. Mental health professionals, law enforcement officers, and survivors of domestic abuse spoke openly about the gaps in prevention and intervention. Rachel Holloway's sister addressed one such meeting, her voice shaking as she described her regret at not pushing harder, not asking more questions, not showing up unannounced. "I thought if it got bad enough, she'd tell me," she said. "I didn't realize how dangerous almost bad could be." Schools also faced uncomfortable questions. Evan's anxiety had been documented. Lily's somatic symptoms had been noted. Noah's behavioral changes had been discussed in pediatric visits. Yet none of these signs, viewed in isolation, met the threshold for mandatory reporting. Together, in hindsight, they formed a picture of a household under chronic stress. Superintendents across the state issued new guidance encouraging school counselors and teachers to view persistent anxiety and unexplained physical complaints through a broader lens. Training sessions emphasized that children often manifest domestic instability through subtle symptoms, not disclosures. Michael Holloway's employer conducted an internal review after journalists revealed that he had declined mental health resources repeatedly. The company released a statement expressing condolences but denied any responsibility. Still, the case ignited a broader conversation about workplace mental health culture, particularly among middle-aged men conditioned to view vulnerability as weakness. For many, the most unsettling realization was how ordinary Michael had appeared. He was not visibly erratic. He did not fit the caricature of a violent criminal. He was a neighbor, a volunteer, a father seen cheering at soccer games. The banality of his exterior forced a reckoning with the uncomfortable truth that danger does not always announce itself loudly. Media coverage shifted tone as the weeks passed. Initial shock gave way to analysis. Experts explained the phenomenon of family annihilators, categorizing them into types. Michael Holloway was labeled an anomic annihilator by some, motivated by perceived loss of control and identity. Others argued he fit the self-righteous category, believing his actions were justified and necessary. The labels, however, offered little comfort to those left behind. Rachel's sister was granted guardianship of Rachel's remains and oversaw the establishment of a memorial scholarship in her name for nursing students pursuing mental health advocacy. A separate fund was created in honor of Evan, Lily, and Noah to support programs addressing childhood trauma and early intervention. The Holloway home was eventually sold. New owners moved in quietly, repainting the walls, replacing the carpets, trying to erase the echoes of what had happened there. Some neighbors welcomed the change. Others said they could never drive past without remembering the sound of sirens, the sight of flashing lights reflected on manicured lawns. In legislative chambers, the case continued to reverberate. A bill informally referred to as Rachel's Law was introduced in early 2017, proposing expanded training for healthcare providers to screen for coercive control and non-physical abuse. It also sought increased funding for crisis hotlines and faster response protocols for callers at risk. The bill faced resistance, stalled by budget concerns and debates over governmental overreach. For advocates, the resistance felt like a second loss. As time passed, the Holloway murders became a reference point, a cautionary tale cited in conferences and academic journals. But for those who had known Rachel and the children, time did not soften the impact. It sharpened it. Each unanswered question, each missed moment of intervention, lingered like an open wound. And yet, amidst the devastation, something fragile but meaningful began to take shape. Survivors spoke out. Policies were reconsidered. Conversations that had once been whispered became public. The Holloway case did not end violence. It did not solve the complexities of mental health or domestic abuse. But it forced a confrontation with uncomfortable realities, and in doing so, it changed how many people understood the warning signs hiding behind closed doors. By late 2017, the Holloway case had largely disappeared from national headlines, but its impact continued to ripple through Kansas in quieter, more permanent ways. Rachel's Law, initially stalled, was reintroduced with amendments shaped directly by survivor testimony. Lawmakers who had once hesitated now found themselves confronted with parents, teachers, nurses, and counselors who could point to the Holloway family as proof of what happens when coercive control remains invisible under the law. The revised bill expanded mandatory training for healthcare providers, educators, and social workers to include recognition of non-physical domestic abuse. It required emergency departments to implement standardized screening questions designed to detect emotional entrapment, isolation, and fear-based control, not just bruises and broken bones. It also allocated funding for additional hotline staffing during peak hours, a direct response to the unanswered call Rachel had made in her final weeks. In 2018, the bill passed. It was not perfect. Advocates acknowledged that laws alone cannot save lives. But for many, it represented something profoundly important, a public acknowledgement that abuse does not begin with violence, and that prevention must happen long before crisis points are reached. Rachel Holloway's sister became one of the most vocal advocates for these changes. Though she never sought the spotlight, she accepted speaking engagements when asked, standing before audiences with quiet resolve. She spoke not of Michael, but of Rachel. Of her kindness, her exhaustion, her fear of being judged. Of how hard it is to leave when the danger isn't obvious to outsiders, and when the person causing fear is also the person society expects you to trust. Rachel didn't need someone to rescue her, she told one audience. She needed someone to believe her fear was real. The Holloway children were remembered differently, each in their own way. Evan's school established a peer support initiative focused on anxiety awareness in adolescents. Lily's artwork, salvaged from the family home, was displayed in a local community center during Mental Health Awareness Month. Noah's preschool planted a small garden in his name, a space meant for quiet reflection and play. These gestures did not erase loss, but they anchored memory in purpose. Dr. Karen Patel, the pediatrician who had treated all three children, later reflected publicly on the case. She spoke about the limitations of clinical practice, about how symptoms are often treated in isolation because systems are built that way. We look at stomach aches, sleep problems, anxiety, she said. What we don't always ask is what environment those symptoms are growing in. Her words became part of continuing education materials for pediatric care across the state. The Holloway case also reshaped conversations around masculinity and mental health. Michael Holloway's journals, released in redacted form, were studied by psychologists examining how entitlement, fear of abandonment, and identity collapse can intersect dangerously. Experts emphasize that his actions were not the result of untreated depression alone, but of a belief system that framed control as love and ownership as responsibility. This distinction mattered. Public messaging began to shift away from vague narratives of snapping or mental breaks toward more accurate discussions of coercive dynamics and warning behaviors. Law enforcement training incorporated case studies highlighting how family annihilators often show patterns long before violence occurs. Rigid thinking, grievance accumulation, and perceived loss of status. Still, the most profound changes occurred at a personal level. Survivors who followed the Holloway case reached out to shelters and counselors in greater numbers. Hotline operators reported an increase in callers who explicitly referenced Rachel's story, saying they didn't want to wait until it was bad enough. Friends and family members became more willing to ask difficult questions, to push past discomfort when something felt wrong. In Johnson County, a memorial bench was placed in a small park not far from the Holloway home. It bore 4 names. There was no description of how they died, just a simple inscription about love, remembrance, and vigilance. Those who visited often left flowers. Some left notes. Others simply sat. For Dr. William Holloway's colleagues and friends, grief took on a complicated shape. Many struggled with anger toward Michael, alongside guilt for not seeing what lay beneath the surface. Support groups formed quietly, spaces where people could talk about the shock of discovering that someone they trusted was capable of unimaginable harm. The question that lingered for everyone was the same: could this have been stopped? There is no single answer. The Holloway case was not the result of one failure, but of many small gaps aligned at precisely the wrong moment. An unanswered call, unshared fears, systems that treated warning signs as isolated data points rather than a collective signal. But legacy is not measured only by what was lost. It is measured by what changes because of that loss. Today, Rachel Holloway's name appears in training manuals. Her story is discussed in classrooms where future nurses, teachers, and social workers learn how to listen more carefully. Evan, Lily, and Noah are remembered not as victims, but as children whose lives now inform better protections for others. The Holloway tragedy stands as a reminder that danger does not always look dramatic, and that silence is not safety. It challenges us to recognize that love without respect can become control, and that control, left unchecked, can turn deadly. If there is meaning to be found, it lies in this: paying attention earlier, believing fear sooner, and refusing to dismiss quiet warning signs simply because they are uncomfortable to confront. The Holloway family cannot be brought back, but their story continues to speak. And if we are willing to listen, it may save lives. Story 3. On a cold January evening in 2015, the quiet suburban town of Lakewood, Colorado, settled into its usual routine. Porch lights flickered on as families finished dinner, children prepared backpacks for school, and snow lined the curbs in soft, uneven piles. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever seemed to happen, where neighbors waved politely but rarely intruded into each other's lives. That sense of safety would be shattered within hours, replaced by a case that would haunt the state for years and expose deep cracks in the way warning signs are ignored until it is far too late. The Whitman family lived in a modest 2-story home on West Alameda Parkway. From the outside, there was nothing remarkable about it. Beige siding, a neatly shoveled driveway, a basketball hoop mounted above the garage. Inside, however, the house was the center of a carefully constructed life built on discipline, appearances, and silence. Thomas Whitman was 42 years old at the time. He worked as a senior project manager for a regional construction firm, a job that paid well and carried a certain level of respect. Colleagues described him as reliable, detail-oriented, and intensely private. He rarely joined after-work gatherings, preferring to go straight home. To supervisors, this made him look dedicated. To coworkers, slightly aloof. Born in Des Moines, Iowa, Thomas grew up in a strict household where emotional expression was discouraged. His father, a former military mechanic, believed order and obedience were signs of strength. His mother deferred to her husband in nearly every decision. Friends from Thomas's childhood later recalled a boy who followed rules obsessively, who panicked when plans changed, who struggled when he felt out of control. But those traits were never addressed. They were praised. Emily Whitman, his wife, was 38. She had been a high school English teacher before stepping away from full-time work after their second child was born. Emily was known in the community as warm, patient, and deeply involved in her children's lives. She volunteered at school events, coordinated carpools, and baked for neighborhood fundraisers. She smiled easily in public. Very few people knew how hard that smile was to maintain. Emily and Thomas met in 2003 at a mutual friend's barbecue in Denver. She was drawn to his stability. He was drawn to her empathy. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony attended mostly by family. On paper, their life unfolded exactly as expected. A home in the suburbs, 2 children, steady employment, the image of success. Their first child, Lucas, was born in 2007. He was quiet, observant, and academically advanced for his age. Teachers described him as polite and anxious, a child who sought reassurance constantly. Their second child, Sophie, arrived in 2010. She was energetic, outspoken, and creative, often drawing elaborate pictures and telling long, imaginative stories. The siblings were close, bonded by routine, and an unspoken understanding that home life required careful navigation. Behind closed doors, the Whitman household operated under invisible rules. Thomas controlled the family's finances entirely. Emily was given a monthly allowance deposited into a separate account. Purchases beyond groceries required discussion, sometimes permission. Thomas framed this as responsibility, as planning for the future. Emily told herself it was practical. Thomas monitored schedules obsessively. He expected meals at specific times, homework completed in a precise order, weekends planned days in advance. Deviations triggered tension. Raised voices were rare. Disappointment was expressed through silence, clipped remarks, long looks that communicated displeasure without words. Over time, that silence became heavier. Emily began to feel constantly evaluated. Her teaching credentials sat unused, but Thomas discouraged her from returning to work, insisting the children needed stability. He reviewed her text messages casually, asking who she had spoken to and why. He discouraged friendships he deemed dramatic or negative influences. When Emily resisted, he accused her of being ungrateful or irresponsible. There were no bruises, no police calls, no dramatic incidents neighbors could point to and say, "This is where it went wrong." What there was instead was erosion. By late 2014, Emily confided in her sister that she felt trapped, that she was always walking on eggshells, that Thomas's mood seemed darker, more volatile, especially after he learned his company was considering restructuring. Though his position was technically secure, the possibility of change unsettled him deeply. Thomas began sleeping less. He spent hours late at night reviewing spreadsheets, emails, contingency plans. He complained frequently about being undervalued at work, about people not pulling their weight. He grew increasingly irritable with the children, correcting minor behaviors sharply. Lucas began having stomach aches before school. Sophie started wetting the bed again. Emily suggested counseling. Thomas refused. In December, Emily quietly contacted a local therapist on her own. During her first session, she described feeling afraid, not of physical harm, but of emotional collapse. She worried that Thomas saw the family not as people, but as extensions of himself. The therapist encouraged her to build a support network, to think about safety planning if tensions escalated. Emily nodded but left feeling overwhelmed. She wasn't sure she was ready to take steps that would shatter the image of her life. On January 12, 2015, Emily told Thomas she wanted to separate. She chose the moment carefully, waiting until the children were asleep. She spoke calmly, explaining that she felt lost, that she needed space, that she hoped they could co-parent respectfully. Thomas listened without interruption. His face revealed nothing. When she finished, he asked a single question. "Are you taking the kids?" Emily hesitated. I think we should talk to a mediator." Thomas nodded slowly. He said he needed time to think. Over the next 3 days, he barely spoke. He went to work as usual. He helped Lucas with homework. He braided Sophie's hair before school. To an outside observer, everything looked normal. But internally, something had shifted. Phone records would later show Thomas spent hours researching family law, custody outcomes, and stories of men who had lost everything in divorce. He visited online forums filled with grievance and resentment. He searched phrases like starting over after losing family and what happens when children are taken away. On the evening of January 16, Emily packed a small bag, planning to stay with her sister for the weekend to give Thomas space. She told the children she would be back soon. Lucas hugged her tightly. Sophie asked if she was leaving forever. Emily promised she was. That promise would never be fulfilled. When Emily didn't respond to texts the following morning, her sister assumed she was busy. By afternoon, concern grew. Calls went unanswered. When she drove by the Whitman house, she noticed all the curtains were drawn. The driveway was empty. By nightfall, police were notified. What they would eventually uncover inside the Whitman home would become one of the most disturbing family annihilation cases in modern Colorado history. Not because it came without warning, but because so many warnings had been quietly ignored. And the worst part was yet to come. Police arrived at the Whitman residence just after 8:40 p.m. on January 17, 2015. Snow crunched under their boots as they approached the front door, which was locked. There were no signs of forced entry. The house was dark, unnaturally still. A welfare check quickly escalated when officers peered through a side window and noticed something that made one of them step back in shock. The living room was immaculate, but the stillness felt staged, like a room prepared for inspection rather than lived in. After forcing entry, the smell hit them first. It wasn't immediately recognizable, just heavy and wrong, lingering in the warm air of a closed house in winter. The officers moved slowly, calling out names that went unanswered. Emily Whitman was found in the upstairs master bedroom. She was lying on the bed, fully clothed, her hands folded over her stomach. There were no obvious signs of a struggle in the room, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. Only a pillow on the floor beside the bed and faint bruising on her neck that told a story far different from the peaceful scene Thomas had tried to create. In the children's rooms, the devastation deepened. Lucas was found in his bed, his favorite science book still open beside him. Sophie lay in her room surrounded by stuffed animals, one arm draped over a worn teddy bear she had slept with since infancy. Both children appeared as if they had been tucked in carefully. Autopsies would later confirm that they had been smothered in their sleep. There was no sign of Thomas Whitman. By midnight, the house was a crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across the driveway. Patrol cars lined the street. Neighbors stood in clusters, whispering in disbelief. Some cried openly. Others stared at the house, replaying small interactions in their minds, searching for moments that might now seem ominous in hindsight. Detectives from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office took over the investigation. The initial working theory was grim but increasingly familiar in domestic homicide cases. A family annihilation followed by the suspect fleeing the scene, possibly with intent to die by suicide. Emily's phone was found in her overnight bag, still zipped, untouched. There were no defensive wounds on her body, suggesting she had been caught off guard or had not believed she was in danger until it was too late. Toxicology reports later showed no drugs or alcohol in her system. Thomas's phone, however, was missing. Bank records revealed that earlier that morning, Thomas had withdrawn nearly $12,000 in cash from a branch he rarely used. Surveillance footage showed him alone, calm, methodical. He wore a heavy coat and a baseball cap pulled low. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. Detectives began piecing together the timeline. Based on the medical examiner's findings, the murders likely occurred in the early hours of January 17, sometime between 2:00 and 4:00 a.m. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual. The snowfall that night muffled sound, erasing any chance that a struggle might have been overheard. Investigators found no suicide note in the home, but Thomas's computer told a different story. His browser history showed searches that had continued well into the night. Articles about custody battles, divorce statistics, stories of men who felt betrayed by the legal system, forums filled with rage disguised as advice. One bookmarked article stood out. It discussed family annihilators, describing how some perpetrators viewed their actions as a form of twisted protection, a way to spare loved ones from perceived future suffering. Detectives exchanged uneasy glances. The language mirrored what they were seeing in the house, the careful positioning of bodies, the absence of chaos, control even in death. The search for Thomas expanded rapidly. An all-points bulletin was issued statewide. His vehicle, a dark gray Subaru Outback, was entered into national databases. Credit card activity was monitored. Border crossings were flagged. Photos of Thomas circulated through media outlets, accompanied by warnings that he was considered armed and dangerous, though no firearm had yet been located. Public reaction was swift and intense. Parents kept children home from school. Community meetings were held in packed gymnasiums where residents demanded answers. How could this happen here? How could no one have known? Emily's friends spoke to reporters, describing her as kind, devoted, and exhausted. Several mentioned that she had seemed withdrawn in recent months, but none had imagined the depth of danger she was facing. As the days passed, the lack of sightings fueled anxiety. Tips poured in from across the country. Some claimed to have seen Thomas at gas stations. Others thought they spotted him at rest stops or motels. Each lead was chased down, each one ending in disappointment. On January 21, 4 days after the murders, a breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A park ranger in the San Juan National Forest reported an abandoned vehicle matching the description of Thomas's Subaru. It was parked at a remote trailhead, partially covered in snow. Inside the car, officers found a duffel bag containing clothing, food supplies, and a handgun registered to Thomas. There was also a folded map with a trail circled in red. No body was found. Search teams descended on the area, battling harsh winter conditions. Helicopters scanned from above. Dogs tracked scent trails that disappeared into dense forest. The terrain was unforgiving, a maze of cliffs, ravines, and snow-covered paths. For 2 days, the search continued. Then, on the morning of January 23, a hiker spotted something unnatural near the edge of a steep incline. A flash of fabric, a shape that did not belong to the landscape. Thomas Whitman's body was found at the base of a ravine, nearly 200 feet below the trail. The cause of death was blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. The handgun found in his vehicle had not been fired. Authorities concluded that Thomas had taken his own life. With that determination, the active manhunt ended, but the questions did not. Why had there been no outward signs? Why had Emily's fear remained largely invisible? Why had no system flagged Thomas's escalating behavior, his obsessive thinking, his growing isolation? As the town prepared funerals instead of school events, as Luca's and Sophie's classmates struggled to understand why their desks were suddenly empty, the Whitman case began to shift from an active investigation to something broader and more unsettling. A case study, a warning, and a mirror held up to a society that often equates quiet with safety and control with stability. The hardest part, many would later say, was realizing that nothing about the Whitman family looked broken enough to save. The official conclusion did little to quiet the unease that settled over the community. If anything, it deepened it. In the weeks that followed, as memorial flowers wilted outside the Whitman home and snow melted into slush along the curb, investigators continued reviewing every fragment of Thomas Whitman's life, not because they expected new charges, but because they needed to understand how a man who had once coached Little League and volunteered at school science fairs could become the architect of such devastation. Emily's friends came forward one by one, their recollections forming a picture that was painfully clear only in hindsight. She had grown quieter in the months before her death. She canceled plans. She stopped answering messages promptly. When asked how she was doing, she gave careful, practiced responses. Tired, she would say. Busy, just stressed. To those who knew her well, the exhaustion felt deeper than that, but Emily never crossed the invisible line that would have triggered intervention. She never said she was afraid. She never said she was in danger. Her emails told a different story. Detectives obtained warrants to review her personal accounts, and there, buried between school reminders and grocery lists, were drafts that had never been sent, messages to her sister that ended abruptly, notes typed late at night, describing arguments that escalated from words to silence, from silence to intimidation. She wrote about feeling watched in her own home, about Thomas's fixation on control, about how every disagreement ended with him reminding her what he stood to lose if she ever left. One draft stood out. "I don't think he would hurt us," Emily had typed, then deleted, then typed again. "But sometimes I'm not sure anymore." She never sent it. Financial records added another layer. Thomas's business ventures had been failing quietly. On the surface, he maintained the image of stability, but behind closed doors, debts were mounting. Loans were maxed out. Credit cards were near their limits. Emails showed he had been denied a refinancing application just days before the murders. In his mind, the life he had built was collapsing, and he blamed Emily for wanting out, for refusing to continue pretending everything was fine. Psychologists consulted by investigators pointed to a familiar pattern, not sudden madness, not an impulsive snap, but a slow, inward spiral marked by entitlement, resentment, and a distorted sense of ownership over one's family. Thomas did not see his wife and children as independent individuals with their own futures. He saw them as extensions of himself, possessions tied to his identity. When that identity felt threatened, he chose annihilation over loss. The children's schools held separate counseling sessions for students and parents. Teachers struggled to explain the unexplainable without instilling fear. Lucas's science teacher spoke through tears as she described how he had stayed late one afternoon to ask about building a volcano model for the next fair. Sophie's classmates left handwritten notes in a basket outside her classroom, drawings of rainbows and hearts, messages promising they would never forget her. National media attention followed, bringing with it uncomfortable scrutiny. Talk shows debated whether the warning signs had been missed. Headlines asked why family annihilators were almost always men, why domestic violence still hid so effectively behind closed doors, why society struggled to take emotional abuse seriously until it turned lethal. Thomas's parents released a statement expressing shock and grief, apologizing to Emily's family, insisting they had no knowledge of their son's inner turmoil. They asked for privacy. Some extended family members quietly disappeared from public view, unable to reconcile the man they loved with the crimes he committed. Emily's sister was less restrained. In a televised interview, she spoke directly to viewers, her voice steady but raw. She talked about how easy it was to dismiss discomfort, how often women are taught to manage men's emotions rather than confront them. She urged anyone who felt unsafe, even if they couldn't fully explain why, to trust that instinct. "You don't need proof to protect yourself," she said. "You don't need bruises to be in danger." Advocacy groups seized on the case, using it to push for expanded domestic violence resources, particularly for emotional and psychological abuse. Lawmakers referenced the Whitman murders during debates over restraining orders, mandatory counseling referrals, and early intervention programs. Some progress followed, but slowly, as it always did. The Whitman house was eventually sold. New owners repainted the walls, replaced the flooring, planted fresh shrubs in the front yard. From the outside, it looked like any other family home again. Inside, only those who knew the story could sense the absence, the weight of lives erased in a single night. Years later, the case would still be cited in criminology courses, analyzed in documentaries, referenced in discussions about warning signs and prevention. But for the people who lived it, for those who knew Emily, Lucas, and Sophie, it was never an abstract lesson. It was a constant, aching reminder of how fragile normalcy can be, and how violence does not always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, behind locked doors, wearing the face of someone you thought you knew. In the years that followed, the Whitman case refused to fade into the background of public memory. While other tragedies briefly captured headlines and then slipped away, this one lingered, resurfacing whenever another family annihilation occurred somewhere else in the country. Investigators, journalists, and scholars returned to it again and again, not because it was unique in its brutality, but because it was disturbingly familiar. Dr. Elaine Morrison, a forensic psychologist who later reviewed the case for a national study, described Thomas Whitman as terrifyingly ordinary. There were no prior arrests, no restraining orders, no emergency calls from neighbors, no explosive public incidents that would have marked him as a threat. Instead, there was a quiet accumulation of grievances, entitlement, and fear of exposure. Morrison argued that cases like Whitman's were among the hardest to prevent precisely because they did not fit the public stereotype of violence. Thomas never ranted online. He never threatened coworkers. He never raised his voice in public. His control was private, subtle, and persistent. He isolated Emily not by forbidding her from seeing people, but by making it emotionally exhausting to do so. He framed his jealousy as concern, his criticism as guidance, his resentment as sacrifice. Over time, Emily began to doubt her own perceptions, a psychological erosion that left her feeling trapped but unsure why. When the trial transcripts were later released to the public, one detail stood out with chilling clarity. In the hours before the murders, Thomas had searched for phrases related to family reputation, financial ruin, and starting over without shame. Prosecutors argued that these searches revealed his distorted logic. He believed that destroying his family would preserve his image, that death was preferable to public failure. In his mind, he was not committing murder. He was preventing humiliation. Emily's family chose not to attend the sentencing hearing. They submitted a written statement instead, read aloud by the judge. It spoke of birthdays that would never be celebrated, of empty chairs at holidays, of a future that had been violently stolen. It ended with a simple sentence that echoed through the silent courtroom. They trusted him. Thomas was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He showed little visible reaction. No tears, no protest, just a slight tightening of the jaw as the sentence was read. When asked if he wished to make a statement, he declined. To the end, he offered no explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement of the lives he had erased. Prison records later revealed that Thomas struggled to adapt to incarceration. He avoided group programs, refused counseling, and spent long hours alone in his cell. Guards noted that he maintained a rigid routine, exercising obsessively, reading financial magazines long after his wealth had become irrelevant. He received no visitors. His parents stopped writing after the first year. Whatever narrative he had built to justify his actions collapsed under the weight of isolation. Outside the prison walls, Emily's legacy took on a life of its own. Her sister established a foundation in Emily's name focused on early intervention for domestic abuse, particularly emotional and psychological control. The foundation funded counseling services, legal aid, and educational programs designed to help people recognize non-physical warning signs of danger. Schools invited speakers to talk about healthy relationships. Employers partnered with advocacy groups to provide confidential resources for employees who felt unsafe at home. One program, inspired directly by Emily's story, encouraged people to trust subtle discomfort. It emphasized that fear does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it disguises itself as guilt, obligation, or loyalty. The program's slogan was simple: if you feel trapped, you are. Lucas and Sophie were remembered in quieter ways. A scholarship fund was created in Lucas's name for students interested in science and engineering. Sophie's elementary school planted a flowering tree in her honor, its branches filling with pink blossoms each spring. Children who never met her played beneath it, unaware that it stood as a memorial to a life cut short. The Whitman case also left a permanent mark on law enforcement training. Departments across the country began incorporating it into domestic violence seminars, emphasizing the danger of escalation during periods of financial stress, separation, or perceived loss of status. Officers were trained to take emotional abuse reports more seriously, even in the absence of visible injuries. Judges received updated guidance on evaluating risk factors in custody disputes and restraining order hearings. Still, progress was uneven. Every few months, another headline appeared. Another family. Another quiet neighborhood. Another perpetrator described as a devoted parent, a respected professional, a man no one suspected. Each time, the Whitman case was mentioned, a reference point in an ongoing national conversation about violence behind closed doors. Emily's sister once said that justice, in the traditional sense, never truly arrived. A prison sentence could not restore what was lost, but she believed that meaning could still be created from devastation. If Emily's story saved even one life, if it helped someone recognize danger before it was too late, then her voice, silenced in life, would continue to speak. The house where the murders occurred stands unchanged now, just another address on a quiet street. Children ride bicycles past it. Neighbors wave hello. Life goes on as it always does. But beneath the normalcy lies a truth that cannot be erased. Evil does not always look monstrous. Sometimes it looks like stability. Sometimes it looks like success. Sometimes it looks like love twisted into possession. The Whitman case reminds us that violence does not begin with blood. It begins with control, with fear, with the belief that another person's life exists to serve your own. And it ends with silence where laughter once lived. Story 4. It began on a quiet Sunday morning in May 2019, the kind of morning that makes violence feel impossible. In the suburban town of Brookhaven, Georgia, the air was warm but gentle, birds nesting in manicured trees, sprinklers ticking softly across trimmed lawns. Inside a two-story beige house on Willow Crest Drive, a woman named Rachel Coleman made coffee while her 8-year-old son argued with his younger sister over a cartoon playing too loudly on the television. From the outside, the house looked like hundreds of others in the neighborhood, indistinguishable, forgettable, safe. At 9:18 a.m., a 911 call came in from Rachel's phone. The dispatcher would later say the line stayed open for 17 seconds. No words, just breathing. Then a sharp noise, then silence. By the time police arrived, 3 people inside the home were already dead. To understand how Brookhaven became the center of a case that would later expose systemic failures across multiple states, investigators would need to rewind nearly 15 years, back to a different town, a different life, and a man who learned early on how to hide in plain sight. Rachel Coleman was born in 1986 in Macon, Georgia, the middle child of 3 sisters. Friends described her as gentle, observant, the type of person who listened more than she spoke. She worked her way through nursing school while waitressing nights, determined to build a life that felt stable, predictable, and safe. After graduating, she moved to Atlanta for better opportunities, eventually specializing in pediatric care. It was a job she loved, one that gave her a sense of purpose and control. She met Daniel Mercer in 2007 at a friend's 4th of July barbecue. Daniel was charming in an understated way. He wasn't loud or flashy. He listened intently, laughed at the right moments, remembered details. He worked in logistics for a regional shipping company and spoke often about ambition, growth, and responsibility. To Rachel, he felt grounding, reliable, the opposite of chaos. They married 2 years later. For the first few years, their life followed a familiar rhythm. Promotions, a mortgage, weekend trips. 2 children, Evan and Lily, born 18 months apart. On social media, their life looked idyllic. Smiling photos, family vacations, holiday cards signed with "Love, the Mercers." But behind the curated images, something darker was slowly taking shape. Daniel's need for control didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in through small corrections, comments about Rachel's tone, suggestions about how she dressed, questions framed as concern that gradually became interrogation. Why did she work so many shifts? Who was texting her? Why did she need to visit her parents so often? Rachel explained it away, first to herself, then to others. He's stressed. He worries. He just wants the best for us. By 2014, the marriage had begun to fracture. Daniel lost his job during a corporate restructuring. What he told friends was that he was laid off unfairly. What he didn't say was that his supervisors had documented repeated incidents of volatile behavior, insubordination, and inappropriate conduct. Rachel took on extra shifts to compensate, and with each paycheck she earned, Daniel's resentment deepened. That was the year Rachel first confided in a coworker that she was afraid of her husband, not because he had hit her, not yet, but because of the way his anger felt unpredictable, simmering just beneath the surface. Because of the way arguments ended with him blocking doorways, standing too close, refusing to let her leave until she understood. Because of the way Evan flinched when Daniel raised his voice. In 2015, Rachel filed for separation. Daniel reacted with a calm that unnerved her. He agreed to counseling, promised change, spoke about accountability. For a few months, things improved just enough to keep Rachel hopeful. But beneath the surface, Daniel was preparing for something else entirely. Financial records later revealed that during this period, Daniel began moving money into accounts Rachel didn't know existed. He consulted attorneys without telling her. He researched custody laws late at night. He installed tracking software on her phone under the guise of fixing a technical issue. Each step was methodical, deliberate, invisible. When Rachel finally filed for divorce in early 2017, Daniel's demeanor shifted. Friends noticed it first. He became withdrawn, rigid, obsessed with how others perceived him. He spoke often about being betrayed, about how Rachel was destroying the family. He fixated on the idea of losing his children, not in an emotional sense, but as a loss of ownership. The custody battle was brutal. Rachel documented everything: text messages, voicemails, instances where Daniel showed up unannounced, moments when his anger slipped through the cracks of his carefully maintained public image. The court granted shared custody but ordered Daniel to attend anger management classes. It was a decision that would later be scrutinized with painful intensity. By 2018, Rachel had moved to Brookhaven with the children, seeking a fresh start. She bought the house on Willow Crest Drive with help from her parents and poured herself into rebuilding a sense of normalcy. New routines, new school, new neighbors. She changed her phone number and adjusted custody exchanges to take place in public locations. Daniel followed anyway. He rented an apartment less than 10 minutes away. To outsiders, Daniel appeared cooperative, even devoted. He attended school events, volunteered for carpools, spoke politely with teachers, but in private his messages to Rachel grew darker. Accusations, threats veiled as concern, statements that blurred the line between desperation and menace. "You're tearing us apart. They need their father. If I can't have my family, no one will." Rachel reported several of these messages to her attorney, but without explicit threats, there was little legal action to be taken. She was advised to stay vigilant, to document everything, to trust her instincts. Those instincts told her something was wrong. In April 2019, Rachel requested a modification to the custody arrangement after Evan told her that his father had been asking strange questions. Did he feel safer at Dad's or Mom's? Who did he love more? Would he be sad if Mommy wasn't around? The court scheduled a hearing for June. Daniel knew the date. In the weeks leading up to it, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He stopped attending work consistently, withdrew large sums of cash, gave away personal belongings. He searched online for terms like starting over, family court injustice, and how to make them listen. On May 12, Mother's Day, Daniel arrived at Rachel's house earlier than scheduled for a custody exchange. Rachel hesitated but allowed him inside, wanting to keep the peace in front of the children. Neighbors later reported hearing raised voices but nothing that prompted a call to police. Inside the house, an argument escalated. What happened next would be reconstructed through forensic evidence, phone records, and Daniel's own later statements. Rachel attempted to call 911 when Daniel realized she was recording the conversation. The children were in the living room. By the time officers arrived, the house was silent. Rachel Coleman was found in the kitchen. Evan and Lily were discovered upstairs, still in their pajamas. Daniel was gone. The manhunt that followed would stretch across state lines, drawing national attention and forcing authorities to confront a devastating question. How had someone so visibly dangerous been allowed to move unchecked through so many systems designed to protect? And more haunting still, how many warnings had been missed before it was already too late? The alert went out just after noon. A statewide bolo with Daniel Mercer's name, photo, vehicle description, and last known location was pushed to every patrol car in Georgia. His gray 2016 Toyota Camry had been captured by a neighborhood security camera leaving Willow Crest Drive at 9:31 a.m., less than 15 minutes after the 911 call. The footage showed the car rolling slowly at first, then accelerating sharply as it turned onto Peachtree Road. Inside the Coleman home, investigators moved carefully through what had instantly become a crime scene frozen in time. Rachel's phone lay shattered near the kitchen counter, its screen spiderwebbed, the emergency call still logged but unanswered. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle beyond the kitchen itself. Everything pointed to trust, to familiarity, to violence that erupted suddenly but had been waiting patiently beneath the surface. The children's rooms were untouched except for the beds. Stuffed animals lined the shelves. School projects sat half-finished on desks. One officer later said the normalcy of the rooms made it hard to breathe. Medical examiners would determine that Rachel died first. The children were killed minutes later. Daniel Mercer had not fled in a panic. Gas station footage later that afternoon showed him stopping nearly 30 miles south, calm enough to buy snacks and fuel, his expression neutral, almost bored. He paid in cash. He didn't look over his shoulder. He didn't rush. It was as if he believed he still had time. By the end of the day, the case had exploded across national news. Headlines framed it as a domestic tragedy, another family annihilation driven by custody disputes and unchecked rage. But for investigators digging into Daniel's history, the story was becoming far more complicated and far more disturbing. Within 48 hours, police in Alabama contacted Georgia authorities with new information. Daniel Mercer had been arrested once before, in 2004, in Montgomery County. The charge had been aggravated assault. A college girlfriend had accused him of choking her during an argument. The case never went to trial. The charges were dropped after she moved out of state and declined to testify. The incident never appeared in the custody evaluation. A second report surfaced from Tennessee in 2009. A neighbor had called police after hearing screaming from Daniel and Rachel's apartment during their first year of marriage. Officers arrived to find no visible injuries. Rachel told them it was a misunderstanding. No arrest was made. The report was filed and forgotten. By the time Daniel reached Florida late on May 13, authorities were beginning to realize the scope of the failures that had allowed him to escalate unchecked for years. He crossed into the state just after midnight. License plate readers picked up the Camry near Tallahassee. From there, his movements became erratic. He abandoned highways for rural roads, paid cash for a motel room under a false name, slept for nearly 12 hours. When he woke up, the world had changed. His face was everywhere. Daniel turned on the television and watched as anchors discussed the murders with grim intensity. They showed photos of Rachel smiling beside her children, school portraits of Evan missing a front tooth, Lily holding a handmade Mother's Day card. Former co-workers spoke about Rachel's kindness. Teachers described the children as gentle, bright, loving. No one spoke about Daniel as anything other than a monster. According to later psychiatric evaluations, this was the moment something inside him fractured completely. The narrative he had constructed, the one where he was the wronged party, the misunderstood father, collapsed under the weight of public condemnation. He was no longer in control of the story. And Daniel Mercer could not tolerate losing control. On May 15, authorities located his vehicle abandoned near the Apalachicola National Forest. Inside the car, they found his phone wiped clean and a handwritten note stuffed into the glove compartment. It was addressed not to Rachel but to the court. "You never listened," it read. "You never saw what she was doing. This is on you." A massive search operation followed. K-9 units combed the forest. Helicopters scanned from above. For 3 days, Daniel remained hidden, surviving on bottled water and canned food purchased during his last stop. Then, on the 4th night, he emerged. Just before dawn, a hiker spotted a man sitting near a trailhead, disheveled, barefoot, staring blankly at the trees. When deputies approached, Daniel didn't run. He didn't resist. He simply raised his hands and said, "I'm tired." During interrogation, Daniel spoke for hours. He talked about betrayal, about systems designed to humiliate men like him, about how Rachel had turned the children against him. He insisted he never intended to kill them, that everything had spiraled, that he only wanted to make Rachel understand how much pain she had caused. When detectives asked why the children had to die, Daniel went silent. Eventually, he answered with a sentence that would echo throughout the trial and into the public consciousness. They were part of her. The indictment that followed included 3 counts of first-degree murder, aggravated assault, and kidnapping. Prosecutors announced they would seek life without parole. The evidence, they said, was overwhelming. But as the case moved toward trial, another truth emerged. Daniel Mercer had been evaluated by multiple professionals over the years: therapists, counselors, court-appointed evaluators. Again and again, red flags had been noted, then dismissed. His controlling behavior was framed as anxiety, his anger as stress, his threats as emotional outbursts rather than indicators of lethal intent. Rachel had done everything she was told to do. And it still wasn't enough. As jury selection began in early 2021, Brookhaven prepared itself for months of reliving the worst day in its history. Vigils lined Willow Crest Drive. The house remained empty, a quiet monument to a family erased. And at the center of it all sat a man who believed to his core that the world had forced his hand. The trial of Daniel Mercer began on March 8, 2021, nearly 2 years after the murders, in a packed DeKalb County courtroom. COVID restrictions limited seating, but the gravity of the case ensured every available seat was filled. Reporters lined the walls. Victim advocates sat shoulder to shoulder. Rachel Coleman's parents occupied the front row, holding hands, their faces permanently marked by a grief no amount of time could soften. Daniel entered the courtroom in a gray suit, his wrists shackled, his posture straight. He did not look at the gallery. He stared forward, expression flat, almost bored. To anyone unfamiliar with the case, he might have looked like a man attending a business meeting rather than standing trial for annihilating his own family. The prosecution opened with a narrative the jury would hear repeatedly over the next 6 weeks. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a momentary lapse. This was a slow-burning fire fueled by entitlement, control, and a belief that the lives of others existed to validate his own. They laid out the timeline with precision. The custody hearing scheduled for June. The financial transfers. The tracking software. The escalating messages. The early arrival on Mother's Day morning. Each detail formed a thread, and together they wove a pattern that left little room for coincidence. One of the most powerful moments of the prosecution's case came during the testimony of the 911 dispatcher. The call was played in court, all 17 seconds of it. The room went silent as jurors listened to Rachel's breathing, quick and shallow, followed by a muffled sound, then nothing. Several jurors wiped away tears. Rachel's mother had to be escorted out of the courtroom. Digital forensic experts followed. They testified about Daniel's internet searches in the weeks leading up to the murders. How to win custody battle. What happens if you lose parental rights? Do children remember death? Prosecutors argued that these searches demonstrated premeditation, a man rehearsing a scenario long before he acted on it. The defense objected repeatedly, claiming the searches were taken out of context, that Daniel was spiraling emotionally and seeking information, not planning murder. The judge overruled most objections. Then came the testimony about the tracking software. A cybersecurity analyst explained how Daniel had installed the program on Rachel's phone, granting him access to her messages, location, and call logs. He had monitored her movements for months, mapping her routines, identifying windows of vulnerability. This was not impulsive. This was surveillance. When the children's teacher took the stand, the courtroom shifted again. She spoke about Evan's kindness, about Lily's laugh, about how both children had recently begun asking questions about safety and conflict. She described a drawing Evan had turned in weeks before his death, depicting his family separated by a dark line. The defense presented its case with a different narrative. They argued Daniel was a broken man crushed by a system that favored mothers, a man suffering from untreated mental illness, a man who snapped under unbearable emotional pressure. A psychiatrist testified that Daniel showed signs of narcissistic personality disorder and acute stress response. They emphasized that he had no prior convictions for violent crimes. What they could not explain was the planning. Under cross-examination, the psychiatrist conceded that narcissistic traits do not impair a person's ability to understand right from wrong, that Daniel knew exactly what he was doing. When Daniel took the stand, the courtroom held its breath. He spoke calmly, deliberately, his voice steady. He described feeling erased from his children's lives, portrayed himself as a victim of manipulation, insisted Rachel had weaponized the legal system against him. He claimed he went to the house that morning only to talk. Then the prosecutor asked a single question: "Why bring a weapon?" Daniel hesitated. The pause stretched long enough to feel physical. Finally, he answered that he was afraid Rachel would call the police and he needed to protect himself. The prosecutor leaned in. "Protect yourself from an unarmed woman and 2 children." Daniel said nothing. In closing arguments, the prosecution dismantled the defense's narrative piece by piece. They spoke about coercive control, about how the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic abuse is when they attempt to leave. They told the jury that this case was not about heartbreak. It was about ownership, about a man who believed his family belonged to him. On April 22, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on all counts. Daniel Mercer showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. He did not look back. He did not flinch. Sentencing was scheduled for the following month. At the hearing, Rachel's parents delivered victim impact statements that left the courtroom in tears. Her mother spoke about the sound of Lily's footsteps in the hallway, about how silence had replaced laughter. Her father spoke about Evan's unfinished Lego sets, about birthdays that would never come. The judge sentenced Daniel Mercer to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive terms for related charges. In his remarks, the judge addressed the failures that had preceded the crime, acknowledging that warning signs had been missed, that the system had not acted with the urgency Rachel deserved. "You exploited every gap," the judge said, "and where the system failed, you finished the destruction." Daniel was led away without a word. Outside the courthouse, the sun was bright, too bright. Cameras clicked. Reporters spoke about closure. But for those left behind, closure was a myth. In the weeks following the sentencing of Daniel Mercer, the city of Decatur returned to its routines, but nothing truly went back to normal. The house on Willow Bend Drive sat empty, its windows boarded, its lawn slowly overtaken by weeds. Neighbors avoided walking past it. Some crossed the street. Others stopped, stared, and shook their heads as if the weight of what had happened still pressed against the walls. Rachel Coleman's parents made the decision to sell the home. They said it held too many echoes, too many moments frozen in time. Evan's height marks on the doorframe. Lily's chalk drawings still faintly visible on the driveway. The sound of a life interrupted lingered in every corner. What followed the trial was something few expected. Rachel's case began to ripple outward, beyond Georgia, beyond courtrooms, into policy discussions and legislative chambers across the country. Advocacy groups seized upon the details that had been laid bare during the trial: the documented stalking, the ignored restraining order violations, the delayed custody hearings, the repeated warnings that went unanswered. Rachel had done everything she was told to do. She documented. She reported. She complied. And still, the system failed her. Within months, domestic violence coalitions began citing the Coleman case as a textbook example of coercive control escalating into lethal violence. Seminars were held. Training materials were rewritten. Law enforcement agencies revisited how they assessed risk in domestic disputes, particularly when children were involved. One statistic was repeated again and again. The most dangerous moment for a woman in an abusive relationship is when she attempts to leave. Rachel had been living in that danger for months. In early 2022, Georgia lawmakers introduced a bill informally referred to as Rachel's Law. The proposed legislation aimed to strengthen protections for victims of domestic abuse during custody disputes, requiring expedited hearings when credible threats were documented and mandating closer coordination between family courts and criminal courts. During testimony, a victim advocate read aloud Rachel's final journal entry, found on her laptop after her death. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accusatory, it was practical. A mother's checklist, school schedules, medical notes, emergency contacts. At the end, one line stood alone. If something happens to me, please don't let it happen again. The bill passed with bipartisan support, but legislation could not undo what had been lost. Evan and Lily's school held a memorial ceremony on what would have been the end of the academic year. 2 empty chairs were placed on the stage during the awards assembly. Their classmates were given blue ribbons, Rachel's favorite color. Teachers struggled through speeches. Parents held their children a little tighter that day. Rachel's friends formed a foundation in her name, dedicated to providing legal assistance and safety planning for women navigating high-conflict separations. They named it the Quiet Hour, a reference to the early morning time Rachel had loved, when the world felt still and safe. For Daniel Mercer, life became a rigid routine of concrete and steel. He was transferred to a maximum security facility in southern Georgia, housed in a unit reserved for inmates convicted of crimes against children. He received no visitors. Letters sent to him went unanswered. Appeals were filed and denied. In interviews conducted years later, correctional officers described him as withdrawn, meticulous, always insisting he had been misunderstood. He never expressed remorse, only grievance. Psychologists would later write that Daniel represented a particular category of offender, one who viewed his family not as individuals, but as extensions of himself. When control slipped away, annihilation followed. Experts would come to call it a family annihilation driven not by despair, but by entitlement. Rachel's parents eventually moved out of state. They said Georgia held too many ghosts. On anniversaries, they visited a small memorial garden planted near a river Evan had loved. 3 stones bore their names. No dates, just names. Rachel Coleman, Evan Coleman, Lily Coleman. They said dates felt too final. As years passed, Rachel's story continued to be told in training rooms, classrooms, and court filings. Not as a sensational headline, but as a warning. A reminder that violence does not always begin with fists. Sometimes it begins with monitoring, with isolation, with fear dismissed as overreaction. Her case forced uncomfortable questions. How many warnings are enough? How many reports must be filed? How many systems must fail before urgency replaces procedure? Rachel never saw the reforms her death inspired. Evan never grew into the man his teachers believed he would become. Lily never learned to write in cursive, never cooked the recipes she used to watch her mother make. But their absence changed the way people listened. Today, advocates say Rachel's legacy lives in the pauses taken when a woman reports fear, in the follow-up calls that no longer fall through the cracks, in the recognition that danger is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it leaves behind a story so devastating that ignoring the next warning is no longer an option. Because justice is not only measured in sentences handed down after lives are lost, but in lives saved before another story ever has to be told. Story 5. It began on a quiet Sunday morning in May 2019. the kind of morning that makes violence feel impossible. In the suburban town of Brookhaven, Georgia, the air was warm but gentle, birds nesting in manicured trees, sprinklers ticking softly across trimmed lawns. Inside a two-story beige house on Willow Crest Drive, a woman named Rachel Coleman made coffee, while her 8-year-old son argued with his younger sister over a cartoon playing too loudly on the television. From the outside, the house looked like hundreds of others in the neighborhood, indistinguishable, forgettable, safe. At 9:18 a.m., a 911 call came in from Rachel's phone. The dispatcher would later say the line stayed open for 17 seconds. No words, just breathing. Then a sharp noise. Then silence. By the time police arrived, 3 people inside the home were already dead. To understand how Brookhaven became the center of a case that would later expose systemic failures across multiple states, investigators would need to rewind nearly 15 years, back to a different town, a different life, and a man who learned early on how to hide in plain sight. Rachel Coleman was born in 1986 in Macon, Georgia, the middle child of 3 sisters. Friends described her as gentle, observant, the type of person who listened more than she spoke. She worked her way through nursing school while waitressing nights, determined to build a life that felt stable, predictable, and safe. After graduating, she moved to Atlanta for better opportunities, eventually specializing in pediatric care. It was a job she loved, one that gave her a sense of purpose and control. She met Daniel Mercer in 2007 at a friend's 4th of July barbecue. Daniel was charming in an understated way. He wasn't loud or flashy. He listened intently, laughed at the right moments, remembered details. He worked in logistics for a regional shipping company and spoke often about ambition, growth, and responsibility. To Rachel, he felt grounding, reliable, the opposite of chaos. They married 2 years later. For the first few years, their life followed a familiar rhythm. Promotions, a mortgage, weekend trips. 2 children, Evan and Lily, born 18 months apart. On social media, their life looked idyllic. Smiling photos, family vacations, holiday cards signed with "Love, the Mercers." But behind the curated images, something darker was slowly taking shape. Daniel's need for control didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in through small corrections. Comments about Rachel's tone, suggestions about how she dressed, questions framed as concern that gradually became interrogation. Why did she work so many shifts? Who was texting her? Why did she need to visit her parents so often? Rachel explained it away, first to herself, then to others. He's stressed. He worries. He just wants the best for us. By 2014, the marriage had begun to fracture. Daniel lost his job during a corporate restructuring. What he told friends was that he was laid off unfairly. What he didn't say was that his supervisors had documented repeated incidents of volatile behavior, insubordination, and inappropriate conduct. Rachel took on extra shifts to compensate, and with each paycheck she earned, Daniel's resentment deepened. That was the year Rachel first confided in a coworker that she was afraid of her husband, not because he had hit her, not yet, but because of the way his anger felt unpredictable, simmering just beneath the surface. Because of the way arguments ended with him blocking doorways, standing too close, refusing to let her leave until she understood. Because of the way Evan flinched when Daniel raised his voice. In 2015, Rachel filed for separation. Daniel reacted with a calm that unnerved her. He agreed to counseling, promised change, spoke about accountability. For a few months, things improved just enough to keep Rachel hopeful. But beneath the surface, Daniel was preparing for something else entirely. Financial records later revealed that during this period, Daniel began moving money into accounts Rachel didn't know existed. He consulted attorneys without telling her. He researched custody laws late at night. He installed tracking software on her phone under the guise of fixing a technical issue. Each step was methodical, deliberate, invisible. When Rachel finally filed for divorce in early 2017, Daniel's demeanor shifted. Friends noticed it first. He became withdrawn, rigid, obsessed with how others perceived him. He spoke often about being betrayed, about how Rachel was destroying the family. He fixated on the idea of losing his children, not in an emotional sense, but as a loss of ownership. The custody battle was brutal. Rachel documented everything: text messages, voicemails, instances where Daniel showed up unannounced, moments when his anger slipped through the cracks of his carefully maintained public image. The court granted shared custody but ordered Daniel to attend anger management classes. It was a decision that would later be scrutinized with painful intensity. By 2018, Rachel had moved to Brookhaven with the children, seeking a fresh start. She bought the house on Willow Crest Drive with help from her parents and poured herself into rebuilding a sense of normalcy. New routines, new school, new neighbors. She changed her phone number and adjusted custody exchanges to take place in public locations. Daniel followed anyway. He rented an apartment less than 10 minutes away. To outsiders, Daniel appeared cooperative, even devoted. He attended school events, volunteered for carpools, spoke politely with teachers. But in private, his messages to Rachel grew darker. Accusations, threats veiled as concern, statements that blurred the line between desperation and menace. "You're tearing us apart. They need their father. If I can't have my family, no one will." Rachel reported several of these messages to her attorney, but without explicit threats, there was little legal action to be taken. She was advised to stay vigilant, to document everything, to trust her instincts. Those instincts told her something was wrong. In April 2019, Rachel requested a modification to the custody arrangement after Evan told her that his father had been asking strange questions. Did he feel safer at Dad's or Mom's? Who did he love more? Would he be sad if Mommy wasn't around? The court scheduled a hearing for June. Daniel knew the date. In the weeks leading up to it, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He stopped attending work consistently, withdrew large sums of cash, gave away personal belongings. He searched online for terms like starting over, family court injustice, and how to make them listen. On May 12, Mother's Day, Daniel arrived at Rachel's house earlier than scheduled for a custody exchange. Rachel hesitated but allowed him inside, wanting to keep the peace in front of the children. Neighbors later reported hearing raised voices but nothing that prompted a call to police. Inside the house, an argument escalated. What happened next would be reconstructed through forensic evidence, phone records, and Daniel's own later statements. Rachel attempted to call 911 when Daniel realized she was recording the conversation. The children were in the living room. By the time officers arrived, the house was silent. Rachel Coleman was found in the kitchen. Evan and Lily were discovered upstairs, still in their pajamas. Daniel was gone. The manhunt that followed would stretch across state lines, drawing national attention and forcing authorities to confront a devastating question. How had someone so visibly dangerous been allowed to move unchecked through so many systems designed to protect? And more haunting still, how many warnings had been missed before it was already too late? The alert went out just after noon. A statewide bolo with Daniel Mercer's name, photo, vehicle description, and last known location was pushed to every patrol car in Georgia. His gray 2016 Toyota Camry had been captured by a neighborhood security camera leaving Willow Crest Drive at 9:31 a.m., less than 15 minutes after the 911 call. The footage showed the car rolling slowly at first, then accelerating sharply as it turned onto Peachtree Road. Inside the Coleman home, investigators moved carefully through what had instantly become a crime scene frozen in time. Rachel's phone lay shattered near the kitchen counter, its screen spiderwebbed, the emergency call still logged but unanswered. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle beyond the kitchen itself. Everything pointed to trust, to familiarity, to violence that erupted suddenly but had been waiting patiently beneath the surface. The children's rooms were untouched except for the beds. Stuffed animals lined the shelves. School projects sat half-finished on desks. One officer later said the normalcy of the rooms made it hard to breathe. Medical examiners would determine that Rachel died first. The children were killed minutes later. Daniel Mercer had not fled in a panic. Gas station footage later that afternoon showed him stopping nearly 30 miles south, calm enough to buy snacks and fuel, his expression neutral, almost bored. He paid in cash. He didn't look over his shoulder. He didn't rush. It was as if he believed he still had time. By the end of the day, the case had exploded across national news. Headlines framed it as a domestic tragedy, another family annihilation driven by custody disputes and unchecked rage. But for investigators digging into Daniel's history, the story was becoming far more complicated and far more disturbing. Within 48 hours, police in Alabama contacted Georgia authorities with new information. Daniel Mercer had been arrested once before, in 2004, in Montgomery County. The charge had been aggravated assault. A college girlfriend had accused him of choking her during an argument. The case never went to trial. The charges were dropped after she moved out of state and declined to testify. The incident never appeared in the custody evaluation. A second report surfaced from Tennessee in 2009. A neighbor had called police after hearing screaming from Daniel and Rachel's apartment during their first year of marriage. Officers arrived to find no visible injuries. Rachel told them it was a misunderstanding. No arrest was made. The report was filed and forgotten. By the time Daniel reached Florida late on May 13, authorities were beginning to realize the scope of the failures that had allowed him to escalate unchecked for years. He crossed into the state just after midnight. License plate readers picked up the Camry near Tallahassee. From there, his movements became erratic. He abandoned highways for rural roads, paid cash for a motel room under a false name, slept for nearly 12 hours. When he woke up, the world had changed. His face was everywhere. Daniel turned on the television and watched as anchors discussed the murders with grim intensity. They showed photos of Rachel smiling beside her children, school portraits of Evan missing a front tooth, Lily holding a handmade Mother's Day card. Former co-workers spoke about Rachel's kindness. Teachers described the children as gentle, bright, loving. No one spoke about Daniel as anything other than a monster. According to later psychiatric evaluations, this was the moment something inside him fractured completely. The narrative he had constructed, the one where he was the wronged party, the misunderstood father, collapsed under the weight of public condemnation. He was no longer in control of the story, and Daniel Mercer could not tolerate losing control. On May 15, authorities located his vehicle abandoned near the Apalachicola National Forest. Inside the car, they found his phone, wiped clean, and a handwritten note stuffed into the glove compartment. It was addressed not to Rachel but to the court. "You never listened," it read. "You never saw what she was doing. This is on you." A massive search operation followed. K-9 units combed the forest. Helicopters scanned from above. For 3 days, Daniel remained hidden, surviving on bottled water and canned food purchased during his last stop. Then on the 4th night, he emerged. Just before dawn, a hiker spotted a man sitting near a trailhead, disheveled, barefoot, staring blankly at the trees. When deputies approached, Daniel didn't run. He didn't resist. He simply raised his hands and said, "I'm tired." During interrogation, Daniel spoke for hours. He talked about betrayal, about systems designed to humiliate men like him, about how Rachel had turned the children against him. He insisted he never intended to kill them, that everything had spiraled, that he only wanted to make Rachel understand how much pain she had caused. When detectives asked why the children had to die, Daniel went silent. Eventually, he answered with a sentence that would echo throughout the trial and into the public consciousness. They were part of her. The indictment that followed included 3 counts of first-degree murder, aggravated assault, and kidnapping. Prosecutors announced they would seek life without parole. The evidence, they said, was overwhelming. But as the case moved toward trial, another truth emerged. Daniel Mercer had been evaluated by multiple professionals over the years: therapists, counselors, court-appointed evaluators. Again and again, red flags had been noted, then dismissed. His controlling behavior was framed as anxiety, his anger as stress, his threats as emotional outbursts rather than indicators of lethal intent. Rachel had done everything she was told to do, and it still wasn't enough. As jury selection began in early 2021, Brookhaven prepared itself for months of reliving the worst day in its history. Vigils lined Willow Crest Drive. The house remained empty, a quiet monument to a family erased. And at the center of it all sat a man who believed, to his core, that the world had forced his hand. The trial of Daniel Mercer began on February 8, 2021, nearly 2 years after the murders, under the shadow of a pandemic and the weight of a community still struggling to comprehend what had happened. The courtroom in DeKalb County was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, every seat spaced, every movement deliberate, every breath heavy. Rachel Coleman's parents sat in the front row, flanked by relatives and close friends. They held photographs of Evan and Lily, laminated, as if to protect what little remained. Daniel entered the courtroom wearing a gray suit that hung loosely on his frame. He had lost nearly 30 pounds while in custody. His hair was cropped short. His eyes rarely lifted from the table in front of him. When he did look up, it was never toward the families. It was toward the jury. The prosecution's opening statement was measured, almost restrained. They did not raise their voices. They did not rely on theatrics. Instead, they laid out a timeline so precise it felt mechanical. They spoke of planning disguised as compliance, of obsession masked as devotion, of a man who believed that control was love and that punishment was justice. They told the jury this was not a crime of passion. It was a crime of entitlement. Over the following weeks, the courtroom became a place where the past was dissected inch by inch. Witnesses came forward to paint a picture of Daniel Mercer not as a monster from birth, but as a man whose violence escalated gradually, predictably, and in full view of systems designed to stop it. Rachel's co-workers testified first. They described the change in her demeanor over the years, how she became quieter, more guarded, how she began parking closer to the hospital entrance, how she once asked a supervisor to walk her to her car because Daniel was waiting outside unexpectedly. One nurse recalled Rachel saying, "He doesn't hit me, he just makes it hard to breathe." The custody evaluator took the stand next. Under oath, she admitted that Daniel had demonstrated rigid thinking patterns and a heightened need for dominance. When asked why those observations hadn't resulted in stricter custody restrictions, she said the language at the time did not meet the threshold for intervention. The jury listened as text messages were read aloud. "I'm nothing without them. You think you can erase me. If you take my kids, you'll regret it." Each message had been sent months before the murders. Each one had been reported. The defense strategy was built around diminished capacity. Daniel's attorneys argued that years of perceived alienation had pushed him into a dissociative state, that his actions were the result of a psychological break rather than intent. They presented expert testimony describing narcissistic injury, emotional flooding, and impaired impulse control. Then the prosecution cross-examined those experts. They asked about the money transfers, the phone tracking software, the research into custody laws. The methodical steps Daniel took to avoid detection, the fact that he fled the state, the fact that he abandoned his car, the note he left for the court, none of it aligned with a mind acting without awareness. Perhaps the most devastating testimony came from Evan's teacher. She described a boy who had grown quieter in the months before his death, who flinched at loud noises, who once asked her what happened when someone disappeared forever. She described Lily clinging to her backpack every morning, afraid to leave it behind. When the medical examiner testified, the courtroom went still. The cause of death for all three victims was detailed with clinical precision. The sequence of events was reconstructed based on injuries, blood patterns, and time stamps from Rachel's phone. The prosecutor paused before asking the final question. Were the children conscious? Yes, the examiner answered. Several jurors looked away. Daniel never reacted. Midway through the trial, the defense made a critical miscalculation. They put Daniel on the stand. For the first time, the jury heard him speak directly. He described himself as a devoted father, as a man pushed to the edge, as someone who lost everything. He cried when talking about his children, but when pressed about their fear, their pain, his voice hardened. He framed their deaths as collateral damage in a war he believed Rachel had started. Under cross-examination, the mask slipped. The prosecutor asked a simple question. Did you believe your children belonged to you? Daniel hesitated. They were my responsibility, he said. That wasn't the question, the prosecutor replied. Did you believe they belonged to you? Yes, Daniel said finally. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. That single word unraveled the defense. In closing arguments, the prosecution returned to that moment again and again. They spoke about ownership, about entitlement, about how the most dangerous individuals are often the ones who feel most wronged. On March 22, 2021, after less than 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all counts. When the judge read the verdict, Rachel's mother collapsed into her husband's arms. Daniel stared straight ahead, expressionless. He did not look at the jury. He did not look at the families. At sentencing, Daniel was given 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge's words were direct and unflinching. You did not lose your family, she said. You destroyed it. But even as the courtroom emptied and the sentence was handed down, the case was not finished. Because what Daniel Mercer did was not an anomaly. It was the inevitable result of a system that had seen the warning signs and chosen, again and again, to look away. The sentencing marked the legal end of Daniel Mercer's case, but it was only the beginning of what the murders forced the country to confront. In the weeks that followed, as headlines faded and court transcripts were archived, the impact of what happened to Rachel, Evan, and Lily continued to ripple outward, touching lawmakers, advocacy groups, family courts, and thousands of survivors who saw their own stories reflected in the evidence that had been laid bare. Rachel Coleman's parents returned to their home in Indiana carrying boxes of belongings that had been released by the police. Clothes still smelled faintly of hospital detergent. Children's drawings were stacked in careful piles. A pair of tiny shoes sat by the door, never to be worn again. Grief did not arrive all at once. It came in waves, sometimes triggered by silence, sometimes by the most ordinary details. A grocery list, a voicemail, a forgotten lunchbox tucked into a cabinet. They decided early on that they would not let their daughter's death become just another statistic. Rachel had documented her fear. She had followed every rule. She had trusted the system, and the system had failed her. Within months, Rachel's parents began speaking publicly. At first it was small gatherings, domestic violence awareness events, candlelight vigils. Then it became legislative hearings, conferences, closed-door meetings with judges and policymakers. They spoke not only about what Daniel Mercer did, but about everything that happened before he did it. The ignored reports, the minimized threats, the assumption that because Daniel had not yet crossed an invisible legal line, he was not dangerous. Advocates seized on the case as a stark example of coercive control, a pattern of behavior that often precedes lethal violence but remains poorly understood and inconsistently addressed in American law. Unlike physical abuse, coercive control leaves few visible marks. It manifests in surveillance, isolation, financial domination, threats disguised as concern. It erodes autonomy slowly, invisibly, until the victim no longer feels safe making even the smallest decisions. Rachel had lived inside that erosion. In late 2021, Illinois lawmakers introduced a bill expanding the legal definition of domestic abuse to include coercive control. Testimony from Rachel's family was entered into the legislative record. So were excerpts from her messages, her journals, and the custody filings she had hoped would protect her children. The bill passed with bipartisan support, making Illinois one of the first states to explicitly recognize coercive control as grounds for protective orders. Other states followed. Family courts began reassessing how custody evaluations were conducted, particularly in cases involving documented patterns of intimidation or obsession. Training modules were updated. Risk assessment tools were revised. Judges were encouraged to look not just at past violence, but at escalation, fixation, and entitlement. Still, for many, these changes came too late. Rachel's coworkers established a scholarship in her name for nursing students committed to working with survivors of abuse. Evan and Lily's school planted 3 trees in the courtyard, one for each life lost. Beneath them, a small plaque reads simply, "Be kind, be brave, be vigilant." Daniel Mercer was transferred to a maximum security facility in another state. He has filed multiple appeals, each denied. In interviews with prison psychologists, he continues to frame himself as a victim of injustice, as a father robbed of his children. He has never expressed remorse in a way that centers their suffering, only his own. Experts say that is not unusual. The danger, they warn, lies not only in men like Daniel Mercer, but in the narratives that allow them to exist unchecked. Narratives that equate jealousy with love, that dismiss threats as emotional outbursts, that prioritize parental rights over children's safety, that demand visible bruises before believing invisible terror. Rachel Coleman tried to tell her story while she was still alive. After her death, others began to listen. Survivors across the country reached out to her family, sharing stories of custody battles gone wrong, of warnings ignored, of fear dismissed as hysteria. Many said they had stayed silent because they had been told that speaking up would only make things worse. Some said they saw Daniel's words echoed in their own abusers' messages. That recognition became a call to action. Nonprofits expanded hotlines and legal aid services, specifically for parents navigating high-conflict separations. Judges began issuing emergency custody modifications more readily when credible threats were present. Police departments reviewed how domestic violence reports were categorized and escalated. Progress was uneven. Resistance remained. But the conversation had shifted. Rachel, Evan, and Lily became more than victims. They became evidence. Evidence that violence does not begin with a weapon. It begins with control. Evidence that the most dangerous moment for an abuse survivor is often when they try to leave. Evidence that children are not bargaining chips, not property, not extensions of an adult's wounded pride. Years from now, when legal scholars study the evolution of domestic violence law, the Mercer case will be cited not for its brutality alone, but for what it revealed. How many opportunities existed to intervene? How close the system came to preventing the tragedy? How devastating the cost of inaction can be, Rachel Coleman loved her children fiercely. She believed in rules, in institutions, in doing things the right way. She believed that documenting abuse would protect her, that asking for help would matter, that justice would arrive in time. It did. But through the changes sparked by her death, through the voices she amplified even after she was gone, her belief endures in a different form. Not as blind trust, but as hard-earned resolve. Resolve to listen sooner, to act faster, to believe victims before it's too late. Because behind every case file is a family. Behind every warning sign is a life hanging in the balance. And sometimes, the only difference between tragedy and survival is whether someone chooses to take fear seriously. Rachel did everything she was supposed to do. Now the responsibility belongs to all of us. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Midnight. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious.